And welcome back, fellow football fanatics. This is College Football with Sam. It's been a pretty hectic week. Adobe has been a little bit inconsistent in terms of exporting my files, so it's taken me longer to do show prep. It's why it's been a few days since we've been live, and I've also been trying to catch up with other things. But here we are. We're back. And we're going to be discussing Big Ten and SEC quarterback rankings, along with why I'm buying stock into certain teams and programs, and discussing bold predictions, as we always do. Thank you for tuning in, and as we get started here, I would appreciate it if you liked the show, if you subscribed to the channel, and hit the notification bell. It's been hot where I live, but thankfully I have blinds and I have air conditioning. So hopefully wherever you're at, you're safe, you're not too hot, not too cold. Thank you again for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And if you want me to say anything, I'm kind of on a time crunch today. I completed an interview with Jake Butt this morning. That will be out in the next 48 hours, and I'm going to have interviews with the Kirkwood and Dunn show and also Chris Drew. Those will be dropping in the next few days. So we're tight on time today. Tomorrow I'll have more fluidity to maybe answer some comments. But if you want me to say anything, say something in the chat. And if you want to get my attention, especially send in a super chat. So do those things like the stream. And let's just get started here and talk about first the Big Ten quarterback rankings. Then we will do the SEC quarterback rankings. Who are the top 10 quarterbacks in the Big Ten entering 2026? Let me know down below, and today I'm going to go through my top 10 quarterbacks, the best 10 quarterbacks in the Big Ten, starting from number 10, going up to number 1, and there are different tiers in this list that I will explain along the way, because of course, not every quarterback is separated by the same margin. At 10th, I have Anthony Colandrea, Nebraska's Anthony Colandrea now, formerly UNLV, formerly at Virginia. I left out Malik Washington. He was 11th. A huge part of that has to do with my view on Maryland's supporting cast, Maryland's coaching, and Maryland's development, which I view among the most negatively in the Big Ten. If Malik Washington was on a better team, he would be ahead of Colandrea and not quite half the quarterbacks on this list, but close to half of them. I really love Malik Washington, just do not love what's around him. In fact, I kind of hate what's around him. With Colandrea, he had issues with turnovers at Virginia, had some still at UNLV last year in terms of fumbles, but he had a PFF grade of 90.1, a QBR that was top 60, which for a G5 QB I would say is serviceable, and he passed for over 3,000 yards and seemingly fixed his interception problem. Colandrea has arm talent. He has zip on the football. He's uber mobile. He almost reminds me a bit of more so a historic or traditional Nebraska quarterback. And with Jeep Wade coaching that offensive line with, I thought I turned the camera on. That's weird. Hold on. Thought I did turn that camera on. It's so strange. But let's see maybe if this fixes it. Yep, okay, that fixed it. Cool. Well, thank you for your patience there. But anyway, Colandrea sort of reminds me of a traditional Nebraska quarterback with the legs, the toughness, the outspoken leadership, and there is some limitations in terms of what he does through the air, and he does have some downside. The good news for Nebraska is within the system that Dana Holgorsen is running this year, with Jeep Wade coming in to coach the offensive line, and with the receivers Nebraska has, he has a pretty good supporting cast, and I believe that his skill set fits his supporting cast like a hand into a perfectly made glove. We have Colton Joseph here at 9th, and Colton Joseph is a fascinating quarterback. Came from Old Dominion, ran an RPO system there under Ricky Rane, who used to be the offensive coordinator at Penn State before becoming the head coach at Old Dominion in 2020. Joseph helped lead Old Dominion to a 10-3 season last year, 21 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. Indiana fans know him well from running all over them in week 1, where he had a QBR of 69.2 and a respectable completion percentage given the system he was in, decent PFF grade. And when I look at what Wisconsin needs, as Wisconsin's rebuilding the offensive line, I don't really like what they have at receiver this year. Their backfield is probably their strength at running back, and it's not because I believe running back's amazing. The rest of the offensive line is in total rehaul mode. You need a quarterback in Colton Joseph who can put the team on his back. And while Joseph could lose you a game, or perhaps two, with some of the turnovers that he produces in his volatility, he also more likely than not will win you several games with his skill set if the defense is playing at the level it did later in the season last year and the rushing attack is better than the bare bone unit that it was in 2025. Rocco Becht is at 8th for me at Penn State, transferring in from Iowa State. There's a separation here from 10th and 9th to 8th. We're jumping up into a tier here. Becht is proven as a passer, as a quarterback, as a game manager. He had the 52nd QBR last year, PFF grade at 80, completed 60.5% of his passes. The reason Becht isn't higher is what I would describe as limited upside. He is not as athletic or as talented as many of the quarterbacks ahead of him, and people, whenever they talk about him in terms of why do you love him, a lot of it has to do with gutsiness or clutchness. And when people use those terms, those things do matter a whole lot. But what separates the elite quarterbacks from the good quarterbacks is the elite quarterbacks have that, and then a lot of tangible X factors. And Becht doesn't really have a tangible X factor. He's still in a tier above the prior two QBs we've discussed because of his experience, because he can lead a game-winning drive, and because he is more of a winning factor than he is a liability. But still, the Big Ten is deep at quarterback this year. He is one of the better quarterbacks in college football, not quite one of the best, though. Nico Iamaleava is in a similar tier. Iamaleava is not as proven as Becht, but he has upside. He has superior athleticism. He had 13 touchdowns and 7 interceptions last season, QBR that was a 60.8, and what Iamaleava is receiving is a massively upgraded supporting cast. A coaching staff upgrade that, much like Michigan, going from Sharon Moore to Kyle Whittingham, Indiana going from Tom Allen to Curt Cignetti, although that's a much more extreme example, as we all know, with them winning the national title. I don't think we can quantify the amount of coaching upgrade that UCLA is receiving. And consequentially, I believe that Iamaleava is going to have a huge season and the best of his career so far as a college quarterback. They're going to run him. He will complete closer to probably 70% of his passes in that system. And that was a huge get for Bob Chesney and his staff to have Iamaleava return to UCLA when, given his history in the portal, there had to be decent odds that he was going to enter it. Damon Williams Jr. is in another tier. So we had the Rocco Becht and Nico Iamaleava tier. Before that, there was Colton Joseph, Anthony Calandria, and look, Malik Washington, Drake Lindsay were probably in a tier with those. Williams is in another tier where the upside is practically limitless, and they may not be as, say, experienced as Becht, and they're not as experienced / clutch as the players ahead of them. But Damon Williams Jr. can be a Kyler Murray type athlete. When he threw for 3,065 yards last season, 25 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, and he also had several rushing touchdowns and a few hundred rushing yards. He did it with practically no offensive line and several injuries at the skill positions throughout the season. He needs to do better in the big games, but most quarterbacks need to anyway. And I've been impressed with his performances at Washington and how Jed Fish has coached him up. When I think about Damon Williams, I think of someone whose decision-making could improve, who could use more experience, and it's good that he was able to start through all of last season, but he can throw a nice, deep throw, intermediate throw. He can put zip on the ball. He has a nice touch to the football. He is turning into a complete quarterback before our very eyes, and this season, Washington is going to be even better than they were last year, in large part because he's coming back. Bryce Underwood is 5th here, ahead of all of these players that we've already talked about and behind those in front of him. And that's pretty redundant to say, but I'm saying it because there's a lot of controversy behind this player in the preseason. He didn't help himself by talking arrogantly last preseason and being way too confident in himself, but his QBR was top 30, his PFF grade was 70, and he had no QB coach and no coaching staff, to be frank. Now, supporting cast is upgraded, the coaching is upgraded, the schedule is tougher. So what will happen with Bryce Underwood going from a freshman to sophomore campaign? Well, I don't believe that he will be better than the 4 quarterbacks ahead of him, including Julian Sayin, Dante Moore, Josh Hoover within IU system, Jaden Maiava within USC system. And we'll talk about those players in a few minutes here. I do believe, though, that Underwood will see improvement here. Like I just mentioned with UCLA, it's hard to quantify going from Deshaun Foster to Bob Chesney. It's also hard to quantify going from Sharon Moore to Kyle Whittingham, and from Chip Lindsey to Jason Beck, who worked with a quarterback at Utah and Devin Dampier, who is a Walmart version of Bryce Underwood. More of an athlete than a passer, but Underwood has higher upside and more talent, so if they can unlock that within him, he could also become a great passer. I have him in a similar tier with Williams, where they just need more experience, and they need more confidence, and they need an upgrade in terms of supporting cast, and especially with Underwood, an upgrade in coaching to be successful. And maybe these next 2 QBs are in their own tier. I kind of feel bad for putting these quarterbacks all in tiers of 2, but I think this tier will be a group of 3, actually. These next 3 QBs do not have the upside of DeMond Williams or Underwood, in my opinion, in terms of college quarterbacks. They just don't have the same mobility, and I don't think their arms are much better, or in some cases better at all. But they have more experience, and they have a degree of accuracy and a degree of football IQ and of running the offense at a high level that especially Underwood as of right now, and even Williams to a lesser degree, just don't have. And Jaden Maiava is one of those quarterbacks. Maiava was 2nd in QBR last year. He had an 86.2 PFF grade, 89.9 QBR, 24 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. He struggled with turnovers on the road, was fantastic at home, at times played well on the road, and he had almost 4,000 passing yards, which in the modern college football world, with new clock rules, that is a rarity to come within 300 yards of 4,000 passing yards when you only play in 13 games. That's a rarity. He'll be a 5th-year player this fall. It'll be his 3rd season in Riley's offense, 2nd as a starter, and the offensive line should improve, running back should improve, tight end from a receiver standpoint should improve. It sounds like they've mostly reloaded at receiver, and I like Dennis Simmons as a coach there, and Riley's a QB guru. So I trust Maiava and this offense to take a step forward. Maiava is a quarterback that I think just has the Lincoln Riley bug when it comes to playing on the road. Outside of that, and the fact that I don't see a whole lot of upside with him, so I believe DeMond Williams and Bryce Underwood, if their talents were maximized, they would be better quarterbacks than Maiava. Maiava has a very high floor, and he can do what is needed to win big games at the college level. So he's 4th in the Big Ten in my mind. Josh Hoover is 3rd, also in a similar tier with Maiava. Not the highest upside in the world, does have a strong arm. He has the football IQ to have success in Cignetti's offense and to make proper reads he has a turnover problem, throwing 13 interceptions last year, but he also paired that with 29 touchdowns. He completed nearly 2 out of every 3 of his passing attempts. He had a QBR that was 73.6 and a PFF grade of 76.8. The offensive line, receivers, tight ends, running backs, defense, everything in Indiana is better than it was at TCU, probably by a wider margin than the schedule toughness than the schedule toughness in the Big Ten compared to the schedule toughness in the Big 12. That's how much his supporting cast is upgraded. It's also pretty much outside of him and parts of the offense how bad TCU's been over the past several years. Again, with Hoover, the reason he isn't higher is he's an older player and he has shown flaws over the years. He's also shown upside and experience. And I believe that with Cignetti, you're going to be looking at the turnovers being cut down a bit. He'll pass for over 30 touchdowns. And statistically, he will be a top 10 quarterback, maybe even top 5. I have a hard time believing that he will be better than Mendoza. And again, when I look at his build, measurables, mobility, and so on, he doesn't have the upside of DeMond Williams or Bryce Underwood. That doesn't mean that, much like with Jade Mayava, or much like the next quarterback we're talking about, they can't be Heisman caliber players or that their staffs can't develop them into generational quarterbacks. But there's just, from what I'm seeing right now, not as much upside there as with some other quarterbacks on this list. So that, combined with his turnover issues, which I imagine some of those will be rectified, others it could just be in his game, that's going to lead to him being a downgrade from Mendoza. Next up in this same tier is Julian Sayin. He had a 92.9 PFF grade and an 88.4 QBR. Similar QBR to Jade Mayava. PFF grade is above Hoover and Mayava. Had 32 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, 3,610 passing yards, completed 77% of his passes. Sayin is hyper elite when it comes to accuracy, but the arm strength, mobility, and being comfortable when things break down and operating out of structure are areas that, for now, would prevent me from putting him in the highermost tier. That being possible round 1 pick 1, possible generational college QB, which that being, we'll get to him in a few seconds, but Dante Moore. Dante Moore has all the tools, all the upside, the upside of a DeMond Williams or Bryce Underwood. Not quite as mobile, but just from an arm standpoint, what he has shown is above, I think, any other quarterback on this list. And he has shown more mobility than a good portion of quarterbacks on this list. So with Sayin, he's second for me. There's just too much from his accuracy, too much from his decision-making. He has shown flashes of fantastic awareness in the pocket, and as a redshirt freshman, balled out last year. He's incredible. That's why he's number 2. It's why he's ahead of Hoover. It's why he's ahead of Mayava, Underwood, Williams, all of whom I view as top 15 quarterbacks this year. Many of them will be inside the top 10. Sayin for me is definitely top 10, can be top 5, can be anywhere from number 1 to number 10 on a QB list, and I wouldn't be mad at it. Why I don't have him ahead of Dante Moore is just examples in games where those throws, when they're deep, sometimes they're on target, other times they're underthrown. Not every underthrown pass is intentional. It's gotten him in trouble against Miami. It got the team in trouble against Indiana, where if those were thrown with a stronger arm, Ohio State gets a touchdown there, and instead of a pick 6 or settling for a field goal, they probably win those games and probably win it all. So he's a great QB, but as I talked about with Hoover, and I'm trying to deliver it in a kind way so fans don't think I'm hating on these quarterbacks, they do just have some inherent limitations in terms of raw upside and talent that a quarterback like, I think, DeMond Williams or Bryce Underwood don't have. When you look at mobility, when you look at their arm strength, and the things that Sayin is elite at, some of it you can't teach, but a lot of it you can. The difference between a Sayin and a Hoover and what I expected of them this year, and say a Williams and an Underwood, have a lot to do with Sayin and Cignetti having two of the best QB minds and offensive minds in the sport, and Underwood and Williams being thrown into rough situations as younger players. Dante Moore, who I have as the number one quarterback in the Big Ten, is an example of what happens when, look, you get thrown into the fire early, but you have an elite staff that coaches you up. You have a great offensive mind in Will Stein that helps you, and you were competing for round one, pick one last year as a consequence. You stand at 6'3", you have all the arm talent in the world, you have enough mobility where you can be used on some zone reads and some designed runs. You have a 78.5 QBR, which was pretty impressive, a 90.2 PFF grade, 30 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. I do want to see more of Dante Moore stepping up and not being afraid to make the throw, make the 50-50 throw. It got him in trouble a little bit against Indiana, where after that pick six, he looked like a deer staring into headlights and took unnecessary sacks, fumbled the football on one of those sacks, and that helped Indiana snowball into a 56-22 victory. Moore has the talent of some of these high upside players we talked about, but he doesn't have a ton of their inconsistent flaws. There are some inconsistencies in his game, but those are things that are much easier to fix than Underwood having bad mechanics, in some cases even awful mechanics, and being horrifically inaccurate in certain games. It's easier to fix, I believe, than DeMond Williams at times being a one-trick pony and then pulling the football down and not knowing what to do when there's not a talent advantage on his side. So that's why I have Dante Moore as my number one quarterback. And again, the tiers are as follows: Colton Joseph, Drake Lindsey, Malik Washington, and you got Anthony Calandria, then Rocco Becht and Nico Imaliava, then Damon Williams and Bryce Underwood, Jade Mailava, Josh Hoover, and Julian Sayin are, for me, they're in the veterans tier, veterans with elite offensive minds that have a very high floor to them in their current system or based on Julian Sayin, what he's proven to me, and they have enough upside to be in the conversation for possibly being in tier 1, but tier 1 is everything of tier 2 with known, defined, like, round 1, pick 1 NFL upside. Those are my Big Ten quarterback rankings. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below and in the live chat. Now let's talk about the SEC quarterback rankings and my top 10 SEC quarterbacks for the 2026 season. The tiers here will be different as expected. The quarterbacks here will be different. It's interesting, to say the least. So let's again start with number 10. We'll navigate our way creatively to number 1. Top 10 quarterbacks in the SEC entering 2026. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. We're going to start from 10, navigate our way to 1, and I'll explain the tiers that separate some of these placements because not all spots are separated by an equal margin. Sometimes number 2 is much closer to number 1 than they are to number 3, as an example. In terms of the SEC quarterback hierarchy, the perfect place to start out is Marcel Reed. Marcel Reed is a good college QB, but he is very overrated. Very overrated. When you look at his games against Texas and against Miami, where he took unnecessary sacks, he made very unwise decisions in the throwing department, and look, he had a good throw to Mario Craver against Miami, but I could chalk that up to Mario Craver possibly being a first-round pick, and Miami's secondary being a little bit iffy and too reliant on the pass rush last year. Outside of that play, and maybe a few others throughout the year against good competition, he hasn't looked good in the big spots. He nearly cost Texas A&M a win over South Carolina, who is a trash program and was a trash football team last year, where he basically gifted them 2 touchdowns and looked like a John O'Korn, Deacon Hill, Iowa level quarterback. And then he turned it on in the first half, or the second half to his credit, and played much better. Even with a PFF grade of 68.6 and a QBR of 75.6, the receivers, the veteran O-line, the veteran play caller, and Colin Klein, who's now the head coach at Kansas State, with all of that and an easy schedule going for you, there were still many inconsistencies. I think Reed, again, is a good player, but he's way too inconsistent to be great. Way too inconsistent. So I have him at number 10 in my SEC quarterback rankings, and with how much he's losing, I imagine that 25 touchdowns, 12 interceptions could get worse this season in terms of a TD to INT ratio, unless he really improves his game, becomes more accurate, becomes more consistent. I have Byron Brown at number 9 in my SEC quarterback rankings. Transferring into Auburn, following Alex Golesh, going to be running that offense that Alex Golesh ran at Tennessee, that he ran at USF to a lot of success. With a PFF grade of 91.5, 3,158 passing yards, 28 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. And for a G5 quarterback, having a QBR inside of the top 20 is pretty impressive, especially when, look, he played Florida last year. He played Miami, and he had 1,008 rushing yards and 14 touchdowns. So you're telling me he had 42 total touchdowns, 7 interceptions, a good passer rating. I have seen videos of people, criticizing his throwing mechanics, criticizing him as a player. I've also seen posts and videos of people being really high on him. I'm somewhere in the middle, where I think that a lot of his game is going to suffer a drop-off when you look at how much tougher the SEC competition will be. But I also think that he is going to be a good SEC quarterback because there's too much to love from his time at USF to downplay all of it. He's going to be a threat on the ground. He is going to have a good amount of chemistry with his receivers and with his supporting cast, as many of them are coming from USF, and he is going to be in his 5th year in that system. It was USF's quarterback in 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, technically his 4th season, as in 2022, Golesh was not the head coach at USF yet. But Brown, with that system, with the receivers he has some SEC caliber players from Auburn and from other schools coming back or transferring in, so his supporting cast is leveling up too. I like what I see out of him in this system for this fall. He'll have a successful campaign. Austin Simmons, I'm expecting a bounce back from after having a rough start where he threw 4 touchdowns and 5 interceptions at Ole Miss last year. He was the starting quarterback for Ole Miss, and then he wasn't performing well enough, and Lane Kiffin said, okay, I'm going to pull you. I'm going to put in the D2 quarterback named Trinidad Chambliss in. And Chambliss went on to have an amazing season. I trust Eli Drinkwitz with quarterback. I trust him with running the football. I trust him with offense, as he is an offensive mind. And with Austin Simmons' mobility, with his talent, we all remember that one drive against Georgia where Jackson Dart had to be cleared. He came in, he was throwing the ball with some zip and purpose, and he helped create a touchdown drive for Ole Miss. He has the talent. The question is, can he put it together? And I think in this offensive system, with the O-line they're returning, the running backs they're returning, the tight end, and the receivers they have, I like him to have a very strong campaign. I would say that Simmons and Brown are in a similar tier, and they're in a tier above Marcel Reed. I would also put Lenoris Sellers in this category. Sellers has far more upside than either of the previous 2 quarterbacks we've discussed, but the performance and the coaching in my mind is so bad that I can't put him in a tier above. I just can't do it. 13 touchdowns, 8 interceptions last season, QBR of 61. It's just not very good. Only completed 60.8% of his passes, threw for 2,437 yards. There are many overrated quarterbacks in college football, many of them, and 3 of them, Sellers, Reed, and Mateer, reside unfortunately, in the SEC. I see these players get listed as top-end players all the time. And while Sellers is a top-end NFL prospect because those GMs and scouts will not be able to get over the measurables, he's not a top-end college player. He's not. There's a lot that he has to prove with South Carolina, along with his head coach Shane Beamer and his roster for this upcoming season. I have Aaron Philo up next. Philo, you're looking at a quarterback who is the 6th best, in my opinion, in the SEC. What I love about Philo is that he has only played in Buster Faulkner's system. I love that he has experience previously at Georgia Tech with an inferior supporting cast. I like that that's really what it boils down to. The mobility. How could I forget about the mobility? He has legs. And with Florida's offensive line, which has some upside but also some inconsistency, and with Buster Faulkner as his offensive coordinator for now the 3rd year in a row, with some of the receivers he has, the rushing attack that he has, I would expect him to blossom, start for Florida, and come out and have a fantastic 2026 season. He's going to be one of the better quarterbacks in America. And as I just talked about some of the overrated quarterbacks in the SEC, he is an underrated quarterback in the SEC. Would put him, due to how unproven he is, in a similar category, in a similar tier to the previous 3 quarterbacks we've discussed. But with that system, I have no doubt that he will produce the best numbers and be the best player in that group of 4. This is another tier that we're talking about. We're now jumping up from players who have a variety of issues, but have some type of upside or something going for them. We talked about Marcel Reed, and John Mateer was 11th, I believe, on the list, 11th or 12th. I just think that with Oklahoma's defense and with Isaiah Satenia, you didn't have to do much to be OU's quarterback last year and win the way they did. He, again, gutsy, man, above average college QB, not much else. Russell, I know, is not very proven. Some people will be mad that I'm ranking him this high despite not being proven, but this is a prediction. Calm down. I'm predicting that Russell will be a top 15 quarterback in America this year. I believe that Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb know how to coach quarterbacks. I believe that the offensive line, as the season progresses, will improve. Running back, I hate that group. I also don't like what they have at tight end, but they have enough at receiver, and Russell has enough talent on his own to perform well in spite of some of the issues involving his supporting cast. Played well in limited action last year, looked like the far superior quarterback in the spring game, though that is just one practice, but it sounds like he is leading for the quarterback 1 spot right now. And I expect him, again, to be a top 15 quarterback in college football, to throw with accuracy, to throw with nice touch, to be mobile. He'll also have some moments where, look, he's a redshirt freshman. He'll make some mistakes. And with the supporting cast that he has, thankfully the schedule's a little bit easier, you will have moments where he gets blown up or he makes a bad play, a really bad play, and it will be up to him to rebound from that. But I have absolute confidence in his staff and his coach and who he is as a quarterback coming out of high school. And I believe that, look, he's going to do well this year. He's going to be fantastic. Sam Leavitt is at 4th. He's in the same category to me as Keelan Russell, mostly because he's coming off an injury. He looked amazing and was amazing in 2024, but I don't know how this injury is going to affect him. I don't know how the upgrade in opponent faced is going to do for him. Kiffin is a QB guru and an offensive guru, but the situation at Arizona State over the past few seasons has led me to believe that Arizona State staff also knows what they're doing. So with Leavitt, if I knew he was completely healthy, and I knew that some of the issues he had last year were only because of health and nothing else, well, I would confidently put him in the next tier above. But I just can't quite do that right now. He had 10 touchdowns and 3 interceptions, only completed 60.7% of his passes, and only threw for 1,628 yards. He's a potentially elite college quarterback, but if, say, he isn't healthy for the full season and things at LSU take a bit to gel, he could become a liability this year. So I'm putting him at 4th because I have I have confidence in Kiffin and Charlie Weiss Jr.'s offense. I have confidence in that, but I also have some concerns about the possible injury that he's dealing with. And Lane Kiffin, he's preaching caution for a reason, guys. He is. In the next tier, Gunnar Stockton at third in SEC quarterback rankings. He's in a tier of his own. So Stockton is a lot like some of the other quarterbacks I discussed in my Big Ten quarterback rankings, where he does not have the highest upside in the world, but his floor is incredibly high. And really, when you watch his games, 24 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, I've watched him throw beautiful footballs, back shoulder footballs. He needs to be more willing to target the middle of the field, to push the football more, but his legs have been a wonderful tool for Mike Bobo in that offense to utilize to extend drives. He is evolving into more of a passing quarterback as the day goes on. And when you're at Georgia and you have an 81.3 PFF grade and 84.9 QBR, and you don't have a defense to help you, you have some better receivers than you did in 2024, but you still don't have an all-world-class receiver core. A lot of that has to do with you. Just throwing good balls, making good decisions, running the football well, staying healthy throughout the year, seeking out contact, being clutch in specific moments, like that fourth down conversion against Texas. I believe it was on their own side of the field where he threw to that tight end, made the right read, made the right call. He's underrated. A lot of people view him as just an okay quarterback, and the reality is he's a top 10 quarterback for sure, and he has upside to be top 5. This next tier, with Arch Manning and Trinidad Chambliss, is the same tier as Dante Moore. Chambliss is a bit different because he doesn't have the NFL upside of the two, but what he's shown in terms of impact in a college game is also in its own tier. So I'm grouping him with those other two, and that's my top 3 quarterbacks in college football are Arch Manning, Dante Moore, Trinidad Chambliss. Manning improved as the season went on very quietly. He finished with over 3,000 passing yards, had 26 touchdowns, only 7 interceptions, and a 78 QBR. He also showcased his legs and just how fast he is and how dynamic he can be, and certainly gained confidence towards the end. I expect him to make improvements over the preseason, and I'm fascinated to see that Ohio State-Texas rematch and see how he does this season as opposed to last season. Right now, I would say he's practically a lock for round 1, pick 1, barring severe injury or barring regression. Just the measurables he has, the arm strength, the potential, the deep ball accuracy, the mobility, the last name, which is also part of upside because genetics is a fact. Those are things the NFL cannot pass up. So even if he turns out to, say, just be a top 15 college QB this year and disappoints again, I would very easily see him going round 1, pick 1. And I don't think that he will be a disappointment this season. I believe that he is going to be a top 10 quarterback this year at the very worst, and right now I confidently have him top 5 with the improved supporting cast, O-line, receiver, with his mobility, with the upside he has. And look, Sarkisian's a good QB coach. He's not the QB guru that Lincoln Riley is, say, and Ewers did have his issues, but Sarkisian's coached quarterbacks at a high level before, whether at USC as an OC or as a head coach, and he did a fine job with Ewers, I think, now that we know that Ewers had health issues as documented through his multiple seasons at Texas. Trinidad Chambliss is my number 1 quarterback. Top 5 QBR, 22 touchdowns, only 3 interceptions, almost 4,000 passing yards, and that game against Georgia seals it for me. No one else could have had that game the way he did, where he literally put the team on his back and did things off script that were not planned for by Lane Kiffin or by his staff, whether against Georgia the first time or Georgia the second time. He was phenomenal. He hasn't thrown an interception, since the Florida game on November 15th, where he completed almost 75% of his throws and had 301 passing yards. I mean, with 527 rushing yards, 8 touchdowns, 4 yards per carry, he's an incredible quarterback. He's the number 1 QB in college football, and the only reason he didn't put up better numbers is against Georgia and against Miami, his offensive line didn't exactly do him a ton of favors, but they were good enough, and he was able to maneuver around that. If he, say, was in Indiana's offense, or Ohio State's offense, or hey, even put him in Georgia's offense or Texas's offense, you're talking about someone who'd be viewed as a generational quarterback based on his performances last season. And I know Kiffin helps. He no longer has Kiffin, but so many of those plays in the postseason where he didn't have Kiffin and the coordinators were looking at other things or distracted, he still did a phenomenal job. So I view Trinidad Chambliss as my best quarterback in the SEC. Again, the tiers for these top 10 SEC quarterbacks, Marcel Reed grouped with Mateer, who just missed the list. These are good college QBs, but they're very overrated nationally. We got Austin Simmons. We got Lenoris Sellers. We also have Byron Brown and Aaron Philo. They have talent, or they have something going for them, whether talent, supporting cast, or floor, but there's just enough inconsistencies for me to group them together. Russell and Levitt are a bit unproven, but have all the talent in the world. Gunnar Stockton's in his own tier of being super duper reliable. And then Manning and Chambliss are in the game-breaking tier, where, especially with Dante Moore and Manning, because they haven't quite shown this yet, but they're more talented than Chambliss, if they just improve by a little bit, those are quarterbacks that can completely take over a game and win a game on their own, as Chambliss did several times last season. Thank you for watching. Let me know who your top 10 quarterbacks in the SEC are down below. Had some issues in both of those videos, but I will edit those after the fact. These videos will be up sometime between the next 24-48 hours. I appreciate the likes. I appreciate the comments. I see a lot of disagreement and people, for example, getting mad at me for saying Reed wasn't fantastic. With Casey Conception, with Mario Craver, with Borkature, and with the rushing attack they had and the schedule they played, I mean, look, against Texas and Miami, he had no touchdowns and he had 4 picks. He had no touchdowns overall, and he took 8 sacks in both of those games. Against Notre Dame, like, he made some good throws, but Notre Dame's secondary and scheme at the start of the year were absolute trash, and it actually is what partially gives me a pause for Notre Dame this year. Is they did okay against USC, but USC also couldn't pass the football against Nebraska on the road. So, like, is Notre Dame's defense a Don Brown, Al Golden unit where against top offenses it kind of folds up? Or is it really going to evolve into being this lockdown defense? And I don't exactly know what that is. He completed less than 50% of his passes in that game. He had a passer rating that, despite the schedule, the receivers, his legs, all these things that go into his advantage, his passer rating didn't exceed 150 last year. So I have questions about him. I really do. I really have questions about Marcel Reed this year. So that's just my opinion. And yeah, Spencer, I agree. Top 3 quarterbacks, Chambliss, Moore, and Manning are probably the top QBs. I understand doubts about Arch Manning, because while I don't understand doubts about him in terms of NFL draft capital, I understand the idea that, look, at the end of last year, he was a much better player, but I still saw some throws where the accuracy was a bit wonky, to say the least. So I understand doubts there. Personally, I have those as my top 3, and then there's a pretty big drop-off after that. Nicholas, why isn't Underwood a top 10 quarterback in the Big Ten? Especially when, look, with 18 teams and probably a third of those teams having pretty pedestrian QB play, Now that Michigan has a top staff and supporting cast and they bring everyone back, why? It's not why isn't he, because there's not enough. Let me see his numbers. I'm gonna some live research here on college football with Sam. Let's just look at the Big Ten. In the Big Ten, Underwood was 7th in QBR. 7th. And in terms of raw QBR, he was also 7th. In terms of points contributed by a quarterback, again, 7th. Now, I do understand that I understand that the quarterback playing the Big Ten last year wasn't really all that good. I do. But the point is, he was top 10 in the Big Ten last year in QBR, borderline top 10 in PFF. Now that he's entering year 2, like, I'm not even saying he's going to be generational this year. I don't think so. I think he's 5th. It's not. I don't think that's entirely inaccurate, to say the least. I think it's more likely he's going to be a top 5 Big Ten quarterback, or top 6. Let's give some wiggle room. A top 6 quarterback than him being outside of the top 10. I understand that he didn't help himself with his comments last year, and I hate those, and I think that he just needs to shut up and work. But overcorrecting by him being arrogant and saying he's basically Deacon Hill with some legs, and I'm seeing some of those takes on like social media, that's pretty intellectually dishonest. So let's cool down on that a bit. I want to now talk about USC, how I believe the Trojans can win the Big Ten this year, because I think along with Michigan, while the path is rare, there is a path for them to win the Big Ten, and then we will get to some other things. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show for the remainder of its time. And again, if you have anything to say, just type away. I'll answer some chats as I just did. If you really want to get my attention or support the channel, send a super chat, and I will reply to that, and I will give you a shout out for that comment. What is USC's path to win the Big Ten in 2026? Does that path even exist? Can USC win the Big Ten? That's where we should start here. The Trojans are 4th in odds to win the Big Ten at plus 1,400, and they're plus 3,500 in odds to win it all. They're being tied for 14th there, or actually not tied, but right at 14th in odds to win the national title. USC, when you look at where they're placed in the Big Ten hierarchy, is clearly behind the Big Three, but also clearly with Michigan in their own tier. Ohio State, Indiana, and Oregon make up Tier 1. USC and Michigan make up Tier 2. And then everyone else after them pretty much makes up a Tier 3, or at best, Tier 2B. USC's tied with Michigan right now in odds to win the Big Ten. They're slightly ahead of them in terms to win it all, which makes sense when you factor in USC has an easier non-conference schedule. Michigan has a more difficult non-conference schedule, playing Oklahoma at home. Michigan also has to play 2 of the Big Three on the road. USC hosts 2 out of 3. So the schedule for USC to get to the playoffs is a bit more favorable than Michigan's schedule. And also USC's in year 5 with a little bit more proven production, I would say. And Michigan is in year 1. And, you know, when it's your first year, you're typically looking to build up and rebuild, especially after some of the disasters that Michigan has had from a coaching and developmental angle over the past 2 seasons. So USC, if I said in my Michigan video about Michigan's path to win the Big Ten, if I said they could do it, certainly USC could do it. So let's look at the path for USC to win the Big Ten. And I think the schedule is the perfect place to zoom in here. They do get a week 0 game, which I would argue is advantageous. They get an earlier start to the season, and they have an additional bye week. So more time for rest. That should help reduce some of the travel, where they have to travel to Rutgers, to Penn State, to Wisconsin, and to Indiana this year. And a lot of their games on the road or at home are very tough contests that'll likely be close games or physical. So they'll probably have some injuries to deal with, and having 2 bye weeks that are nicely timed, both are in the later half of the season after game 7, that's very helpful in my mind. So that's something to pay attention to there, especially if they get off to a hot start and say upset Oregon, or they enter their first bye with only 1 loss to the Ducks. San Jose State, Fresno State, Louisiana, those are automatic wins. At Rutgers will be a good litmus test before the Oregon game. You have a distraction in Oregon because they will be favored over you. On paper, they're the much better team. So you will have the temptation to focus on them before traveling to Rutgers so you can maybe get a leg up. But Rutgers, with that travel and with the offenses they've had over the past 2 seasons, but especially past season, and their revamped defense, they could give you issues if you look ahead of them. So that's a good litmus test to see where USC is in terms of being able to play competently on the road. In terms of coaching, do they prepare for Rutgers? Do they try to get out fast and just put them away? Or do they have slow starts? That game will tell us a lot, I believe. And then home games back-to-back against Oregon and Washington, that's really tough. And to close that out with a road game against Penn State, it's one of the tougher 3-game stretches I've seen in college football, especially when you take out 3-game stretches that are separated by a bye, like Ohio State playing at Indiana, at USC, and hosting Oregon, but they have a bye that separates 2 of those games. If you take stretches like that out, not having a bye when playing Oregon, Washington, and on the road against Penn State in a row, that's really tough stuff. And if USC is able to get out of that stretch at 2-1, that would be a success, in my opinion, and they would still be in the fight to win the Big Ten. As from my perspective, Oregon's the number 1 power-rated team in the conference, and because of their talent, because of their experience, they have a level of returning starters, returning production, experience, and upside at a variety of positions that on paper, say Indiana doesn't have. Ohio State has the talent, but on paper they don't have the experience either. And I do trust Ohio State and IU from a coaching angle more, and I can see them being power rated ahead of Oregon. But Oregon, in my mind, outside of the road trip to Indiana, is the toughest game on the schedule. That and the road trip to Indiana are the toughest games in my mind. Off the first bye, traveling to Wisconsin is another good litmus test. By then, we will have seen at Rutgers and at Penn State 2 tough road trips, and that will give us a really good idea of who the team is. But at Wisconsin is tricky because it's off a bye, and some teams start rusty off a bye. It's also interesting because it's right before the game against Ohio State, and they get a bye after the Ohio State game. The bye week sets up USC to be rested and to essentially sell out against Ohio State, in the same way that the schedule they have in the non-conference sets them up to be able to sell out against Oregon. It is an advantageous schedule when you factor in where the games are played, the byes being spaced out, and when you take into account that because they're playing in the Big Ten and they can't change their schedule in the same way that other teams can, like former rival or hopefully future rival again, Notre Dame, and some teams in the Big 12 or ACC where the schedules are just much easier if you're able to access top talent. When you're saddled with the Big 3, this is one of the more favorable ways to be saddled with Oregon, Indiana, and Ohio State on your schedule. Do they overlook Wisconsin? Do they not? The Ohio State game on October 31st, that's going to be a challenge. And then off the bye, a trip to Indiana November 14th, hosting Maryland, and then a trip to UCLA. That's a tough schedule. And for USC to have a win total sitting there at 8.5, I think tells the tale that this is going to be a top 15, possibly top 10 team. And I have them 10th in my power ratings. I have them favored to beat every opponent with the exception of Ohio State, Indiana, and Oregon. And I forget if they're I think I have them favored to beat Penn State, but it's not by much, or it's essentially a pick 'em game. And that's factoring in the travel, that's factoring in the home field advantage. They'll be favored in 8 games on the schedule, and they will be a single-digit underdog in 3. As of right now, I have Indiana, I believe, as a double-digit favorite because of, again, the travel, Indiana being at home, and I view Indiana, same as Ohio State and Oregon, as better teams than USC right now. So you're going to have to win games where, on paper, at least right now, you're projected to lose, and you're projected to have inferior rosters, inferior staffs, or a combination of the two. So how do we fix that? Well, USC last year was not a bad team. They weren't even a disappointing team. They went 9-3 in the regular season, and while a loss to Illinois was a bit of a gut punch, and Notre Dame and Oregon winning by double digits was at times a hard pill to swallow, USC was able to earn a huge win over Michigan and clutch wins over Iowa at home and Nebraska on the road to get them to 9 wins. And this was Riley's best team since that 2022 team that won 11 games, fought for a Pac-12 title and a chance at the college football playoff, and went to play in a New Year's Six Bowl. They were a pretty good team last year. They were lacking in some instances, yes, particularly defense, but they showcased a level of balance and execution on offense that we hadn't seen since the Caleb Williams days. And why I believe this offense is better suited for the Big Ten now than it was then is I was more impressed with USC's rushing attack this year than in any of those 2 seasons. I feel as if their backs are better. I feel not quite that their O-line is better yet, but they had a better receiver in Mekhi Lemon and with Jacoby Lane, and they didn't have a Caleb Williams at QB, but Maava was able to operate in a structure that I liked, and they had enough improvements on the defensive side of the ball compared to the Grinch days where they were able to win some games by not scoring, say, 50 points per game against the 3 teams I mentioned, actually. Michigan, they did well offensively, but Michigan got enough stops and forced a turnover. USC had to come up a little bit clutch at times on defense, and it was the same thing against Iowa and the same thing against Nebraska. So they are close. They just need to be pushed ahead in a few areas, and they'll be able to win the Big Ten and have a path to the playoffs. Because, look, if they're competing for Indy, they will be a lock for the playoffs. Guaranteed, with how these Big Ten schedules align. The defense is the area where, time and time again, Lincoln Riley needs to step up there. They were horrific at stopping the run. They were decent at stopping the pass, mostly because they did have some good corners. I think even more so that D-line was pretty damn good in terms of pass rush. But the scheme didn't help in terms of run defense. The coaching at linebacker and safety didn't help. The personnel there didn't help either. The offense, outside of running the football better on the road, was pretty much perfection. And I do believe they will get better there as they return much of their offensive line. They return King Miller and Waymon Jordan, their quarterback. They've upgraded at tight end with Mark Bowman. So, yeah, what more can you ask for in terms of talent with USC? And in terms of returning production, they return 65% of their production, which is more than Washington, Michigan, Ohio State, Indiana, a little bit less than Oregon, and less than UCLA, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Maryland, but USC was way better than all 4 of those teams and actually closer to, say, in Oregon or in Ohio State than those other 4 teams. They were. So, favorable returning production. We've already talked about the talent offensively on the defensive line. We've discussed how they were a top 15 team in metrics last season. What they need to do is fix some minor issues that these other top teams have fixed or are going to fix this year that have helped them, have propelled them to win at a high level. Indiana under Curt Cignetti had some glaring issues in 2024. They even had some issues last year, but they did an elite job fixing them or masking them. Ohio State did that in their 2024 playoff run. Oregon under Dan Lanning, that entire 2024 season where they were winning close games, they were pulling stuff out of their you-know-what, that was good coaching. And this is what USC has missed so far and what they thought they were getting in Riley, and so far they just haven't. I feel as if they're going to finally get that this season. As the offense should improve, I would expect the turnovers to improve, the rushing offense to improve, consequently the red zone touchdown percentage will improve. And those are their weaknesses last year. Turnovers, red zone touchdown percentage, yards per carry, and EPA per rush were their areas of weakness. A lot of that related to the O-line, which I expect to take a step forward. As for the defense, all they were good at was getting pressure, and I expect with the 4-2-5 mint defense that Gary Patterson will run, the quarters coverage, I expect them to still be good at getting to the quarterback, probably improve there just from all that they're returning and the talent they have. Even more importantly, though, I expect them to do a good job, a much better job at stopping the run and a better job preventing explosive plays. That's what I'm thinking with Gary Patterson here. Patterson will be able to coach up the talent in USC's backfield that isn't quite where USC wants it to be yet. The D-line, there's no question about D-line talent, especially when you're running a 4-2-5 scheme. It's not like they're trying to run 3-4 where they need a huge nose tackle. They're not trying to do what Georgia's doing on the defensive line or has done, for example. They want a 4-down line, which is perfect for the Big Ten. They want discipline in the backfield, and they're going to, I think, just teach the fundamentals. And Gary Patterson, being a vet, being a defensive and schematic wizard who invented his own defensive formation, I think he will instill that with the Trojans. So I expect big improvements on defense. The question is how much, because if they're only a top 30 or top 25 defense, it's unlikely that they'll win the Big Ten. Likely they'll go to the playoffs, whether at 9-3 or 10-2. Unlikely that they will win the Big Ten then. If their defense suddenly becomes top 15, say, and they begin to enter that conversation where they're flirting with top 10, top 15, then yeah, with that offense, I could totally see them going 11-1, picking off 1 or 2 of Indiana, Oregon, or Ohio State, and at that point going to Indy would be likely. They also need to improve on special teams. That is an absolute must for them. They return their kicker, Sayori, which helps, and I believe that with the hiring of Mike Eckler, who will be coaching, I believe he's involved with the linebackers, also the special teams coordinator, they will be much better in those aspects. And Eckler brings a level of energy and a level of coaching acumen that really helped Nebraska last year. So I expect him to also help USC out. This staff, it's good. Is it at the top of the Big Ten yet? No, but I see pieces and parts that are. For USC, it's honestly less of a matter of can they, more of a matter of will they. This season, I don't think they will. Things just don't quite align in the way that I would like them to pick USC to win the Big Ten or even make a deep playoff run. I do think they're more than capable of that, though. And between them and Michigan, who I would have in the same tier right now, based on what I'm seeing in preseason odds and preseason predictions, USC is one of the more underrated teams in the Big Ten right now, especially from a potential angle. This is a team that could pop and they sneak into the playoffs and they start pulling what Miami did last year, not in the same way because they're built differently, but instead of just teeing off and getting to the quarterback all the time and messing up offensive game plans, what USC could do with their offense and enough defense from Patterson's quarters coverage is they could be scoring on any defense at will, and then offenses have to be patient in response to them. And as we've seen with some top offenses like Ohio State, or even with USC's offense before, or Oregon's offense, forcing these high-end offenses to be patient oftentimes will cause them to break, especially if their defense can't do that much to help them out. If there is a team that I would trust to win in a shootout this year, USC would be close to the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. So they could do that. And I think 2027 is the year. A lot of people are saying this is not title or bust, but playoff or bust year. And I can see that. At the end of the day, though, if they get to 9 wins again and they play the top teams competitively and win those road trips, beat Washington at home, compete with Ohio State, compete with Oregon, I think that, along with their talent acquisition, NIL, and the growth needed to win 9 games with that schedule, the growth on defense that would be required, would propel them to have a lot of momentum entering 2027. So yes, USC can win the Big Ten. The path to them winning the Big Ten involves a defense that is operating at a top 25 level, offensive improvements, particularly in the run game, and improved coaching performances and game plans on the road. Don't forget about special teams either. I just sort of forget that at the back of my mind because I remember they hired Mike Eckler, and Eckler's one of the best in the business at special teams. Anyway, that's USC. Now I want to briefly talk about Indiana and why they could have the best receiver room in the Big Ten. Before we get to that, I am feeling a little bit dehydrated, so I'm going to take a quick 5-minute break, and we are going to be back talking about Indiana's receiver room. Other content that is up next for today is discussing the Bryce Underwood hate, Matt Rhule being on the hot seat, why I'm buying or selling Oregon and Indiana, and I'm buying both as the title suggests, and a bold prediction about Ohio State having 2 1,000-yard receivers, and UCLA flirting with the college football playoff. So we will be back in 5 minutes. Just need to stretch, just need to get a drink of water. We'll be right back, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell if you want to get notified when we go live. And also, if you want to get notified when our interviews with Jake Butt, the Kirkwood and Dunn Show, and Chris Drew all drop by the end of this weekend. See you guys shortly. Again in 5 minutes. Incredible. We actually got viewer retention. That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, something that I was going to do tonight got canceled, which actually works out because I couldn't attend it anyway. Yeah, excellent. So, Indiana's receiver room, that's what we're going to be talking about now. Then Matt Rhule, then, well, Underwood, then Rhule. You get the gist. Okay, let's do it. Any super chats? Oh, a USC fan. Popping in the chat. Yep. Okay. Could the Indiana Hoosiers have the best wide receiver room in college football this year? I'm not going to say whether or not they do or don't, and for now I don't have them as the best receiver room in college football, but this video isn't about giving a definitive answer. It's about exploring the depth and talent inside of the Hoosier receiver room, as I believe it is one of the best in college football, and it could vie for that number one spot. So Charlie Becker is really the key piece to this here. If Indiana has the nation's best receiver room, you would expect Becker to be a 1,000-yard receiver that is able to not entirely replicate his 20 yards per catch, because that's insane, but have something in between 15 and 20 yards per catch. He would have to double or possibly more than double his touchdowns, and he would have to have good chemistry with Josh Hoover. He is the only returning vet from Indiana's receiver room last year. Technically, Tyler Morris comes back as he was a part of the team last year, but he was injured, was out for the entire season. Omar Cooper Jr., gone on day 1. Elijah Surratt, I believe, was gone on day 3, maybe late day 2. E.J. Williams is gone. Becker at the end of last year was arguably the best receiver on the team, outside of maybe Omar Cooper Jr., but losing that supporting cast is certainly a dent to what was a very strong Indiana receiver room last year. I was talking with a friend of the channel, Baldfather Betts, behind the scenes, and he was discussing how, on paper, Indiana's receiver room last year wasn't super impressive on paper earlier in the year, but as the season went on, they just kept dominating every defensive back group they faced, so they turned out to be one of the best in America. And Chris Drew, him and I were talking in an episode, and I believe he said this in an episode, not behind the scenes, about how last year Indiana probably had the nation's best receiver core. They didn't have the duo of Jeremiah Smith or Carnell Tate, not even close, but they were able to reliably put 4 receivers out there who could all be threats at some level, and by some level I mean at a good level to elite, and really no receiver core last year had that. So with a lot leaving, a good player coming back, and potential in the room, some of that potential has to be turned into production. Nick Marsh is an example of this. He's posted back-to-back seasons with 600 or more receiving yards. He had 6 touchdowns last year and a PFF grade of 67.5 at Michigan State, with 59 receptions. Now, he had horrific QB play. Very inconsistent QB play. And Michigan State was, I believe, the leader in the nation, or one of the leaders in the nation, in negative play percentage on the season, which is just a kind of way of saying their offensive line was A-S. You can guess the third letter there. It was a very bad offensive line, and I will forever be embarrassed at the praise that I gave Jonathan Smith at Michigan State. Maybe his success at Oregon State just had to do with the fact that he knew Oregon State really well and the West Coast. I don't know. Hopefully he'll be back in the coaching rankings at some point, because I do like him. But enough about Jonathan Smith and Michigan State. The point is about Nick Marsh. Nick Marsh is viewed by many as a first-round pick next year. Charlie Becker is also in that conversation. So right off the bat, you have possibly 2 first-round receivers in the 2027 NFL Draft. And a huge part of the reason why I'm so high on Indiana even though I am lower on Hoover than a lot of Indiana fans are probably, and I have been firm in saying that I do not think he'll be Mendoza, is I believe the O-line will improve. I've already been public about the defense improving and being the best in America, in my opinion. The receivers, though, I think they'll have one of the best receiver duos in the country in Nick Marsh and Charlie Becker. And that with a still great quarterback in Hoover, just not quite round one, pick one like Mendoza was, and an improved offensive line and possibly improved rushing attack is going to help the offense really still be a lethal unit, especially in terms of downfield passing, in possession catching, where both Nick Marsh and Charlie Becker excelled. So some of those 50-50 balls that Hoover threw before that could be interceptions, with these receivers, those could turn into catches or even turn into touchdowns. After this, there's a huge drop-off in production at the Power 4 level and at the talent level. Tyler Morris played at Michigan, so showed some flashes in 23 and even 24, but he was never in a system that was going to give him 1,000 receiving yards. Michigan, look, under Jim Harbaugh, in those successful 3 seasons, never had a 1,000-yard receiver. So that was a team that very much was predicated on game control, running the ball, and busting teams that were very QB dependent, rather than being a QB or wide receiver dependent team themselves. Indiana's a bit different. Indiana, we've seen them bust QB dependent teams. So Alabama's a perfect example of this. Simpson was probably the best player on that offense, and they busted them wide open. Oregon was probably more QB dependent than Miami or Ohio State were due to having a worse defense and having worse receivers. I think that also explains part of the reason why they were able to dominate Oregon the second time and beat them firmly the first time, despite playing Miami and Ohio State close, and like Ohio State wasn't 30 points better than Oregon, as the rematch with Indiana could suggest to a casual, and Oregon was better than Miami. Miami just had a better matchup against Indiana than Oregon did. But what differentiates an Indiana from a Michigan is the fact that Indiana is more reliant on the quarterback than Michigan was, and cares more about their receivers and develops them at a much higher level. So with Tyler Morris, if he can stay healthy, he's consistently been thrown around as Indiana's wide receiver 3 or 4 this season. I could see him having a few hundred receiving yards, a handful of touchdowns, and possibly having his really first ever breakout season despite being a redshirt senior. He was a 4-star out of high school, was highly recruited, ended up going to Michigan, and unfortunately for him, he only got to really be with Harbaugh for for really 2 seasons, and only one of them having any significant playing time, and then he had to deal with Sharon Moore and an injury for 2 seasons. Hopefully he can bounce back and have a good year this season. Shaz Preston, transferring in from Tulane, where he had 723 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. He has more production than Morris, was recruited by Alabama under Nick Saban, actually. Just didn't pan out there, went to Tulane, did well under John Summerall. And John Summerall's a good coach. I think he practices toughness and fundamental soundness. So from a mentality angle, I think Preston's at least entering the program being given and taught the right code of conduct, which, as we saw with other teams, just is not always the case. We saw that a lot with Alabama, especially in 2024. The talent was there, but the code of conduct was not. And if you play under Summerall for a few seasons, you're willing to wait your turn, and you do well, I think that shows that you can fit into the culture that Cignetti and Indiana have built. The question is, how talented is he? And whether or not he breaks that starting lineup. I think it's him versus Morris right now for wide receiver 3. I imagine Indiana, being thinner at tight end, will probably use more 4 and 5 receiver sets. We'll just, have to see what happens this season, what the staff thinks, because as much as I could try to guess what would be good, try to talk schematics like I'm a coach, I'm not a coach. I'll probably never be a coach. They know what they're doing over there in Bloomington, obviously, given their 27-2 run over the past 2 seasons. But Preston is a name to keep an eye on. Davion Chandler was talked about a lot in the spring this year. He had a 65-yard receiving touchdown against Purdue last year where he was on a short route. I believe it was, I forget exactly what route it was, but I believe it was a comeback route, and the Purdue defender just completely whiffed on the pursuit and tackle, and Chandler was able to house it. He has talent. He has some speed to him. Shanahan's done a phenomenal job developing. I'm curious to see what happens with him and LeBron Bond this year now that they've had a full year in the program and the system receiving Indiana's development. Indiana's offense last season was the best offense in the country, and I don't think it's particularly close when you look at how the NFL is talking about Mendoza, when you look at how, I would say, their receivers were viewed by the NFL. I mean, Surratt started out in the D2. Omar Cooper was not highly recruited. Becker wasn't highly recruited. They kind of revived E.J. Williams' career just a little bit. Nowakowski wasn't highly recruited, did pretty much nothing at Wisconsin, comes to Indiana, gets drafted. Their receiver room, the combo of tight ends, and not just that, the reason that I agree with Chris's assessment that last year they had the best receiving core, despite not having the intimidating duo of Jeremiah Smith or Cornell Tate, was their downfield blocking. No receiver room blocked downfield the way Indiana's did. And that, combined with their receiving threat and combined with their depth and diversity of body types and modes of attack, is what made them so hard to stop. Ohio State's defense played the best game I've seen an Ohio State defense play in eons, and they held Indiana to 13 points. And there were moments in that game where it felt like they had it and they could have taken the lead. And part of it was the offense. Sure. I mean, Ohio State's offense did themselves no favors there. A lot of that game, though, was Indiana's defense and offense making clutch plays. And with the offense, even without Omar Cooper Jr., Surratt making a possession catch in the end zone and Becker taking the top off Ohio State's elite secondary were a huge part of that. The question with the offense is really just the pass blocking. Everything else is, you check mark it, you sign it off, and you move on. And this receiver room, to me, reads like a receiver room that is either going to take a slight step back, is going to reload, or take a slight step forward. I'm pretty optimistic about this group and its talent and its production. A huge part of that also has to do with my view on Mike Shanahan and Cignetti, who are offensive minds, and Haynes is kind of the head coach of the defense. Cignetti is a receivers coach. Shanahan is a receivers coach. Like, Shanahan is the receivers coach and offensive coordinator and play caller. Cignetti has been a receivers coach before. That's what he was at Alabama. He's coached many offensive positions. So you put those two minds, who are definitely to a certain degree overseeing the receiver room and know it. Shanahan played receiver in college at Pittsburgh. Cignetti played quarterback at West Virginia. I mean, they've been intimately involved in their offense, in offenses in general, with several years of experience and success. So out of all of Indiana's positions on offense, receiver is the one that I trust the most in terms of development and in terms of transforming talent into production, or transforming a unranked player or a 2-star or 3-star into a star at the college or even the NFL level. It's the number one staff in college football, and their specialty, when you look at it, I believe is fundamental soundness. But on offense, I would probably go with receiver, is what their bread and butter has been. When you look at how the JMU players translated, when you look at how they did developing Becker and Omar Cooper Jr., who they inherited from the Allen regime, or they developed exclusively on their own, absolutely. This team could have the best receiver room in all of college football, and right now I would put it as a top 5 receiver room in the nation. It is competing with the other Big Ten schools in the Big Three, Ohio State and Oregon, and a school like Texas that has a stud in Cam Coleman, and Miami that has a stud in Malachi Toney. These receivers are electric in Bloomington. Electric. With Bryce Underwood, the criticism of Bryce Underwood by Eric Weddle and others online is warranted. After all, he came out himself and said, "You've never seen a freshman like me," and then posted 11 touchdowns and 9 interceptions on the season. Not great stuff. But I also want to pair that with my own philosophy that players can improve, especially when they have far superior coaching. So, at the end of the day, his play during the 2026 season is more important than it was last season, or more important than what anyone is saying about him right now. He needs to just tune out the noise. He needs to focus on being a better quarterback and take coaching. Eric Weddle said in an interview a few days ago, quote, "Don't be surprised if the backup's playing early. I don't think Bryce Underwood can throw or play quarterback." Now, he walked back his comments, I believe, a day ago, said he could improve, just said that last year he wasn't accurate. I think that he probably just made those comments in passing, thinking, oh yeah, I saw him play last year, wasn't really good. The backup looked good in the spring game. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that backup was pressing for playing time. And look, Michigan fans were getting mad at it. We're getting mad at Weddle. We're telling him to do awful things to himself. Ohio State fans, of course, were like, yeah, you're correct. This guy is absolute gutter trash. And I think at the end of the day, both are exaggerations. Both have a kernel of truth. Not the bad comments, whether directed at Underwood or Weddle. Those are just wrong. It's sports. This is not real life. Don't tell someone to off themselves because they make you mad. That's stupid. We don't do that here on College Football with Sam. No one should be doing that in life. The point being, on one hand, yeah, should we really expect Underwood to be trash again with a much better supporting cast, with better receivers, with most of the team coming back? Probably not. Should we also say that everything Underwood did last year that was bad was on Brycen Moore? No, because at the end of the day, coaching matters. And I would say, especially in this current age, coaching matters more than talent. The players collectively matter more than the coaches because there's more of them and they make the plays. But if their development or their staff's development doesn't matter at all, then, well, kaput, you're not going to win games. Ed Orgeron and Larry Coker, for example, well, they won titles and people point to them saying, well, you know, if you have the right pieces, development doesn't matter. Oh, that's not true either, because Butch Davis developed that Miami roster, and he was a pretty damn good head coach. And Coker was a good OC, and Shannon, I think, was a good position coach, at least at the time. And Joe Brady's the head coach of the Buffalo Bills, and he was a play caller for that LSU team. Like, that was an NFL coach with, yes, lightning in a bottle roster potential. But then Dave Aranda is the DC, and Aranda was viewed before becoming a head coach as a excellent defensive coordinator. So the truth is somewhere in the middle, I think. And that's why I'm taking the approach that, look, the criticism is warranted. You can't throw 9 interceptions, only 11 touchdowns. You can't look like absolute dog crap against Oklahoma and Ohio State. You can't say it's Matt Patricia versus me, and then Matt Patricia basically takes like a cinder block and just drops it on your head over and over and over again. You can't only complete 60% of your throws when Andrew Marsh is your receiver. So you now have one good receiver at Michigan, which is actually kind of a rarity if you look at Michigan's recent history. At the same time, though, you have to acknowledge that a young player like Underwood being thrown in a disheveled situation with poor game management, poor development, poor coaching, no adult in the room, coordinators and coaches that were yelling at each other, that were not getting along, that were not on the same page, Brycen Moore messaging and possibly calling OnlyFans models in the middle of games. That's not going to help a young player grow, especially the system that Moore wanted to run. Jason Beck runs more of a quarterback-friendly system than what Brycen Moore or his predecessor Jim Harbaugh did. And he's now going to have a dedicated QB coach, and most of that young roster returns, including Underwood, who got a year of starting college experience under his belt. So this Michigan team, Underwood's going to play a huge part in it, and he will decide the season. And at the end of the day, what I said on Twitter, I think, reigns true. He has to prove Weddle and other people wrong. Because based on his play last season, that type of comment is more correct than incorrect, though it's not completely correct. We've seen moments where he has looked like a great QB, or he's been accurate. His receiver core was top 10 in terms of drops, along with Maryland's. Him and Malik Washington were statistically punished with impunity by their receiver cores not being able to catch the football. And that shouldn't be as much of a problem this year for Underwood. But he had flaws, and he had moments where he was not reading the field. I looked to the Ohio State game where Andrew Marsh, he is a much better receiver than Jermaine Matthews as a corner, and you saw that in that game. It didn't matter, though. In no way did it matter. And why didn't it matter? Because Underwood couldn't read the field and panicked and folded under pressure. He can't do those things this year. I expect the defense to take a step forward. I expect the supporting cast to take a step forward. So even if his improvements are minimal, Michigan should still be a better team. The problem is that schedule. Michigan plays one of the toughest schedules in all of college football. And they're going to need a pretty big improvement out of Underwood for them to not regress in terms of regular season wins and losses. I would expect this Michigan offense to function a lot like Utah's offense last year. Excellent at running the ball, good at protecting the QB, not going to turn it over a ton. If there's one area they are lacking in, it probably will be downfield passing, as I think some of Underwood's mechanical issues have persisted into spring, and it will probably take longer than just one spring or one preseason of good coaching for him to be totally quote-unquote fixed. It also might be who he is, where he's just more raw than other QBs coming out of high school, and that was a part of his game that maybe was overlooked, and instead they looked at more of the potential and athleticism there in the recruiting rankings. That's possible too. I'm pretty optimistic, though, about Michigan's offense. Huge part of that has to do with Jason Beck. It has to do with this staff. It has to do with the philosophy and idea that a super talented QB with a great staff, not a staff that I would put up there with Indiana's or Georgia's or Ohio State's quite yet. Not saying it's a cream of the crop elite staff, but it's in that next tier down. I mean, with what Whittingham did at Utah, with what Beck has done at Virginia, New Mexico, Utah, Syracuse, and the fact that he produced Utah's most efficient offense of the 2020s per FPI, per efficiency, produced, I believe, their most efficient offense since joining the Pac-12 and then the Big 12. There is something there. I'll leave you guys with this. When you look at Utah this season, or this last season, you look at the past 5 years, the trend of offenses under Kyle Whittingham. I see 2 bad seasons where they were trying to have a healthy Cam Rising, and he just didn't work. Bryson Barnes wasn't good enough, and the younger brother of Zach Wilson, I think Isaac Wilson, he also wasn't good enough. You look at the offense, and the passer rating has never been better than the 140s. The yards per attempt has never been above 7.5, which is above average, not necessarily good. But look at the offensive efficiency here. Last season, Utah set highs in the 2020s. They were one of the top offenses in offensive FEI. They had an efficiency grade in the mid-80s offensively, which is absurd. And keep in mind that the competition at Michigan is tougher than in the Big 12, but Utah last year also played Texas Tech, 12-2, BYU, also 12-2. They also played Arizona State. They played one of the tougher Big 12 schedules, and they won 11 games at the end. They won 11-2. So you pair that with, yes, tougher competition, but also a superior, more talented supporting cast. and a quarterback who, in terms of build, they've seen before. Like Tyler Huntley, Devin Dampier, maybe even a little bit of Cam Rising, although not, I think Cam Rising might be a little bit disrespectful to Underwood's athletic abilities. But they've had quarterbacks before that can move and have underrated speed to them. And now you pair that with someone whose arm, in terms of ceiling, is better than all of those players. And I think you're looking at an offense that this year is going to pop, and whether or not Underwood improves by a little bit or a decent bit or by a whole lot, this will be one of the Big Ten's better offenses by virtue of what they bring back, and that Underwood's athleticism is good enough where for about, I'd say, anywhere from half to 75% of their games, or even 80% of their games, they're going to be, how do I put this? They're going to have a talent advantage. And that, with this offense and scheme, I think is going to help them produce a lot of points and a lot of yards and effectively control most of the defenses they face. Not all of them. Oklahoma, Iowa, Indiana, Oregon, Ohio State. Those are going to be games where you're going to have to see some of the arm talent show. But with this staff and with the improvements at receiver, why wouldn't there be an improvement in terms of arm talent this year compared to last year? Why wouldn't there be? I have a hard time believing that there will be no improvement. I have a very hard time believing that. And of course there are certain crowds that will say that, but that's just going based off of, certain things. Okay. Let's talk about Nebraska and whether or not Matt Rhule should be on the hot seat. Let's discuss that. Should Matt Rhule be on the hot seat entering 2026? I continue to hear from Nebraska fans, passionate fans, faithful fans, maybe casual observers, a lot of discontent with where things are in the Nebraska program right now. And I've talked about this before, about how last year's expectations were a bit blown out of proportion. So I want to just talk about what Matt Rhule's done so far, very briefly, but also talk about my opinion of what should classify as him being on the hot seat, what justifies him being on the hot seat. Because entering 2026, I don't think he is on the hot seat. I think he's under pressure. I think he could be on the hot seat. If things really unravel, maybe even he could get fired. But with a 50% winning percentage at Nebraska, when Frost and Riley had losing percentages, they were below 500 there. With a bowl win, with back-to-back 7-win seasons, with some close wins, with recruiting at levels that we haven't seen since some of the early hyped Frost recruiting classes, I think that the administration knows it would be unwise to fire him. He hasn't won the Big Ten, hasn't made the CFPs, 0-9 against the AP Top 25, but he's had 2 winning seasons. And at Nebraska, we've not had a coach with 2 winning seasons since Bo Pelini. We just haven't seen that yet. So I understand the frustrations with some of the game management, some of the development, some of the misses with staff hirings. But I also look at this and say, hey, recruiting's going in the right direction. They've tried to get ahead in the NIL front. They've done some good in the portal. Not all good, but Andrew Marshall was a good get at corner. Sear Wright was a good get at corner. You also got to keep in mind thinking about Isaiah Hunter. He was a good get in the portal. And keeping Emmett Johnson home, that was a good move. I think getting Calandria from UNLV could turn out to be a good move in the transfer portal. Pritchett even had a very rough start last year, but towards the end of the year started to come on. That may be looked upon as a good get in the portal who just couldn't pop in year 1 and instead pops in year 2. So I think, as I've said before, I think you got to give Matt Rhule a grade in between a B and a C+, probably, with his time at Nebraska. He has not failed. He also hasn't blown it all out of the water park. He hasn't completely revitalized who Nebraska wants to be. And you see that in the trends here. Before the 2026 recruiting class, they were recruiting at a top 25 level. They have talent to them. And these past few seasons, they've been about a touchdown or more better than the average college football team, which after 2021, in 2022 and 2023, you couldn't exactly say that. So there has been improvement. In terms of regular season wins and losses, there's actually been a linear improvement. 5 regular season wins, 6 regular season wins, 7 regular season wins last season. I believe a lot of the discontentment stems from, look, when you're 93rd in On3's recruiting class, no matter what people say about, well, they're investing for the following year, they're not taking a lot of guys, and they did sign some high-quality players like Danny Odom, the third at corner, who was a 5-star. People are going to look at that and still be nervous and be a little bit mad as fans. It's just in their nature. And Dylan Raiola leaving for Oregon when he was touted as being possibly the savior of Nebraska football, that's just going to be a gut punch no matter what way you slice it. So I understand the frustration. And if you think I'm wrong and you think I'm defending Rhule too much, let me know down below. If you think I'm being too harsh, even, because there probably are some people who are more Matt Rhule defenders than I am, let me know down below too. I'd love to get comments. Engagement's always good for views and for the channel, but I actually read comments. I try to respond to as many of them as I can, and I like to get a pulse and a feeling of what fan bases think about my coverage of their team. The schedule, I think, is the final icing on the cake here, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what Rhule has done in the past if he wins. Oh, well, he only has a 500 record. Well, what if they go 9-3 or 8-4 this year with this schedule? Then everyone's going to forget about previous failures and completely buy in. Ohio, Bowling Green, North Dakota, at Michigan State, Maryland, Indiana, at Oregon, off a bye, Washington, at Illinois, at Rutgers, Ohio State, and at Iowa. This is the toughest schedule I've seen Nebraska face since 2021, when they played at Oklahoma, at Michigan State, at Wisconsin, Iowa at home, Michigan at home, Ohio State at home, Northwestern at home. They also played Purdue that season and Minnesota on the road. I cannot tell you with a straight face which schedule is tougher. If I had to lean towards one, it would probably be 2021, since they played a tough non-con game on the road, but it's close. It's so close. That team went 3-9, was very competitive, lost a bunch of close games. Nebraska, with this schedule, has a win total of 6.5. And for a win total at 6.5 to go 6-6 or 7-5 with this schedule means the books are expecting this team to be Rhule's best team, because the prior two schedules were far easier than this schedule is, at least from my opinion, trying to project how teams that Nebraska will face will perform. People are circling Indiana as a program game. I think Cignetti's an exception to the rule, so a win is nice. You always want to win. Nebraska will be up for that game, and they should try their hardest to win. But I think a better measure for a program game, for where Nebraska's at as a program, is off the bye against Washington. So Nebraska, they should start out 5-0. I predict they will. I strongly believe they will. And probably all but maybe one of those games, if not all of them, will be by double digits. That they're much better than the 3 non-con teams. I think one of MSU or Maryland will play them close, but they'll probably win. They showed they could win close games last year, and they're more talented than those teams. If they're anything other than 5-0 to start the season, I think the conversations about pressure should start to really rise to the surface, because Nebraska's no business losing to Pat Fitzgerald in year 1. They have no business losing to Mike Locksley at home. None. But Indiana at home and Oregon on the road, they're going to lose one of those games, and probably one of them will be a blowout. And odds say they'll lose both of them. So after starting off hot and getting punched in the gut, and even if they don't start off hot, they'll be punched in the gut between one of Indiana or Oregon on the road, how do you respond after that? You have a week to think about it. Washington's coming to town. Washington is not Indiana or Oregon. They're not. Nebraska can beat them. There's a world where Nebraska's favored to win that game due to travel and due to home field advantage, and Nebraska has a good enough roster, and Washington has enough questionable depth where Nebraska, I think it's a rare world, but there is a scenario, at least 1 times out of 100, if not much more than that, where Nebraska's just straight up a better team than Washington is this year. That's a program game right there. And then after that, Nebraska's another program game against Illinois on the road, which is going to be, I believe, a Friday night game at 8 p.m. That's a program game because you have a short resting period, and Illinois right now is viewed as a better Big Ten program than Nebraska due to they don't have the same NIL, and they don't recruit at the same level. They can't. Nebraska's NIL struggles, they look rich compared to Illinois, at least from what I'm seeing. But Bielema's been more of a winner. Bielema has been on a 19-7 run over the past 2 seasons. Rhule's on a 14-12 run by comparison. And one way for Illinois to, say, permanently pass you as a program, at least from the current perspective, would be winning that Friday night game. And there is a good chance where, look, if Nebraska is entering that game 5-3 or 4-4 and Illinois wins, there's a good chance that things just unravel at that point due to the remaining schedule. That's a program game. That October 31st to November 7th stretch that Nebraska has, and you can even lump in Rutgers on the road November 14th, Nebraska should win 2 of those games, if not all 3 of them. If they win any less than that, there's certainly questions to be had. And Nebraska should be favored in 2 or 3 of those games as well. But Nebraska they haven't beaten Illinois since 2023. They haven't won back-to-back road games since the 2000s. They have not beaten a ranked opponent under Matt Rhule at all. And Washington will likely be ranked. Rutgers and Illinois are back-to-back road trips, so statistics say one of those should be a loss. And Bielema is viewed universally as a better coach. So a casual, or just assuming that trends will continue, says that after that 3-game stretch and Ohio State at home and Iowa on the road, that Nebraska probably goes 5-7 and starts off 5-0 and finishes 5-7 due to all those things that I said, where the records against great coaches, against top 25 teams, and obviously playing Ohio State, Indiana, and Oregon, who are just better, and the record against Iowa, you combine all those things together, 5-7 is what historical wisdom says Nebraska will go. And that is where the test and the vigor and the virility of Nebraska's program is going to have to show itself here. I'm not expecting Nebraska to beat Indiana, Oregon, or Ohio State. At this point, just due to the nature of the schedule toughness and the fact it's on the road and what Iowa's built, I'm not even saying they need to beat Iowa to show that they're a fighting program. Go out there and beat Illinois and Rutgers back-to-back. I don't care that it's a back-to-back road stretch. They need to win those games. And what would be really, really nice, because beating Illinois and Rutgers will get you over the win total, you'll have met expectations, and with a tough schedule like this, going 7-5 will be good enough to probably cool the seat down at least a little bit and enter 2027 with some momentum with that recruiting class. You beat Washington at home, and the recruiting is going to go up. The respect for Matt Rhule will improve. They will have exceeded their win total and exceeded expectations, and you will get absolute buy-in from the fan base. That Washington game, that is a game to circle, and I am going to continue to build that narrative because, hey, scenarios are fun, and Washington is still early enough in their build where they have not definitively passed Nebraska yet as a program. In the eyes of many, Illinois and Washington probably are far ahead of them. I don't think so. I think that right now I would have them as better programs than Nebraska, but that's for now. They're not far enough ahead yet where if Nebraska beats both this year, they'll still be behind the 8 ball. Now, if Nebraska beats both this year, there's a good chance they're going 8-4, and Washington will then be 8-4, and Illinois will probably be much worse than that. And Nebraska can say, hey, yeah, we're better than those programs, and those programs have good staffs, and they have a good reputation. For Matt Rhule to be on the hot seat, I think these 4 things need to happen. You need to see a repeat of horrific trench play. The O-line is a lock to improve, I believe, but a minimal improvement there with this schedule would still read as a bad O-line, and the D-line also should improve at a minimum. But again, with how bad it was last season, minimal improvement won't get you many places with this schedule. We also would need to see Calandria being a terrible Power 4 quarterback. So his 26-20 TD-INT ratio at Virginia, in his career he threw 26 touchdowns and 20 picks at Virginia, that would need to return. Potentially worse, because I believe there's enough on Nebraska's roster, offensive supporting cast-wise and defense-wise and special teams, where they could go 7-5 with a pretty bad passing attack, just due to the nature of the schedule, how certain things line up. I mean, Washington should be much better than they were last year, but Nebraska was better than Wisconsin was last year, even at the end of the year. And Wisconsin was awful, and they were able to beat Washington at home due to Washington having some injuries and just certain things that bounced in favor of Wisconsin. Nebraska, I think they have enough roster-wise this year where they can't be totally QB dependent, where last year they were QB dependent. Riola and Johnson were clearly their best 2 players, and Riola being a QB when he went down, just everything was over. I think they'll be better in that area this year. They won't be as QB dependent. So that's why I'm listing 4 things, because I think these 4 things will have to happen for them to really lose cabin pressure. Nebraska will have to miss a bowl game. The fan base will hate it if once again they're 6-6 or maybe even 7-5. But with the tough schedule they have, 6 wins likely means a few blowout wins that will make the fan base feel good, and a few competitive losses against top teams that will cause debate within the fan base and athletic department rather than alignment on the fact that the era has been a failure. And if they lose 6 or more, they will have only beaten bad teams. They will not be able to hold a win over an average or good team and say, I know the season wasn't perfect, but we achieved something. And then last but not least, the team's got to quit. If all of these things happen, Rhule will be on the hot seat, if not fired. If 3 of these things happen, you probably get a hot seat, but not firing. If 2 of the 4 happen, and the 2 are Calandria sucks and the O-line and D-line are bad, but Nebraska finds a way to get to 7 wins and the team shows fight, that's a bit trickier there. As of right now, no, I would not put Rhule on the hot seat. I don't think he deserves to be. I think that his game management and his game day coaching probably deserves a bit more scrutiny than some give him, but I believe that the building of the culture and the staff hirings and firings deserve more credit. He hasn't made the best hires, but he's always been reactive and willing to change when things don't go correctly. And you got to keep in mind last season, if Riola stays healthy, and I know it's a big what if, but in the modern era of college football, you got to give staffs more mercy when a QB goes down because the depth just isn't there. If they don't lose Riola, they win 8 games, and we're talking about this team completely differently even if he transfers out. If they go 8-5 and he transfers out and they beat USC, well, USC finishes with an 8-5 or 9-4 record, and they're power rated high. So now Rhule is a signature win. And even if Riola leaves, he helped Nebraska get their first signature win in eons. I think while there have been failures and there are things that need to be corrected, and if he does not win 7 games or 8 games this year, there's got to be pressure put on him for 2027. As of right now, it's year 4. And he's brought Nebraska back to a level of winning that we haven't seen in basically a decade. So let's see how 2026 goes. I do think he's under some type of pressure, competitive pressure. Maybe the seat's a little bit warm. Should he be on the hot seat now? No. Should he be if, say, they go 6-6 or worse again and go under their win total? I would say yeah. Then that's fair. Okay. Just replying to a few texts here. Okay. And we're good. Perfect. So, absolutely fantastic here. 4 more topics. 4 more of them. And we got good concurrent viewers here too. Make sure everyone is live. We're live right now, obviously. Let's like the stream, get it past 20 likes, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell if you haven't already. And if you are willing to send it a super chat, I would appreciate that. For Oregon, I'm buying every bit of Oregon stock that I can, both for this season and for the future, as long as Dan Lanning and his staff are there and Oregon has the alignment that they do in this era of college football. Why am I buying Oregon's future? Well, when you recruit at the level Oregon does, and then you develop at the level they do, where they have had 2 seasons in a row with 2 first-round draft picks, so 4 total across the past 2 NFL drafts, and you have improved steadily on defense over time, your offense has constantly been innovative and among one of the best in the sport, you have won big games, you have won competitive contests, and the only criticism people have to offer of you is that you got hosed in the playoffs by teams that had a combined record of 30-2, by an Indiana team that was one of the all-time greatest stories in sports history, and possibly the best coach team in sports history, in college football history, I think certainly, and by an Ohio State team that, as we saw from last year's roster and the roster before that, had a generational amount of NFL talent. That's your criticism? Seriously? Well then, sign me up. That's incredible. It doesn't mean every moment will be without pain. It doesn't mean Oregon will win every game. But that reads exactly what Kirby Smart and Ryan Day were going through before they went on to win the national title. Ryan Day got destroyed by Alabama in 2020. He got punked by Michigan in 2021. Michigan, they lost the turnover battle, and they won by 15 points. It felt much more like a 3-touchdown win than a 2-touchdown win. And Ohio State was on the ropes with several needed 4th down conversions to even keep themselves alive. The game, with hindsight, was basically over in the 4th quarter. Michigan won the following year by 22 points. And Ohio State made it to the playoffs, but then fell short against Georgia. Kirby Smart was blown out in back-to-back seasons by Ed Orgeron. Both by Joe Burrow as we know him now, but also by 2018 Joe Burrow, who wasn't super good. He's been handled by Nick Saban and Alabama before in 2020 and 2021. I can bring up game after game after game for those 2 coaches. Even Curt Cignetti, whose path is a little bit different, but he too got blown out by Ohio State in 24 and Notre Dame in 2024. I can bring up several games from those top 3 coaches where they got destroyed in specific matchups. Ryan Day by Jim Harbaugh multiple times, by Nick Saban another time. His game against Michigan in 2024 may as well have counted as a blowout loss because of how bad that game plan was. I have watched Kirby Smart get destroyed before by Alabama, by LSU. I watched Ole Miss completely depants them in 2024. A blowout loss to a top-end team is not disqualifying for being a national title contender or winner. Georgia got blown out in 2021, went on to win it all, and is probably the 2nd best national champion of the 2020s behind Alabama in terms of power ratings. So that is a huge reason I'm buying Oregon here, is I believe their staff is underrated. I too have questions about the coordinators, but their assistant staff, Alik Terry is one of the best O-line coaches in the country. You have Tony Tuioti, who's one of the best D-line coaches in the country. Rashad Samples is a great running backs coach. You also got to consider the wide receivers coach, Ross Douglas, who's excellent at his craft. Maringer has done a great job coaching the tight ends, Hampton coaching the secondary. This is one of the best staffs in college football. And landing right now, I only have behind Curt Cignetti, Kirby Smart, and Ryan Day as a head coach. He is not as proven as those three. He's not won a title like those three. I think he's worse at game management and preparation than those three. His coordinators are worse than the coordinators at those schools. But Oregon has done a really good job doing the little things right and winning at a high level on top of that. They're so close. And I got burned by Penn State last season. I did, admittedly so. Dan Lanning does not have a James Franklin-esque record in big games. He doesn't. He beat Texas Tech last year. He beat USC this past season, Iowa on the road, Penn State on the road at the time that was a top 10 team. The year before that, he beat Ohio State at home in a game that, could have gone either way, and Ohio State was the better team, but he still beat them. It counts, for example. He beat a Utah team in 2022 that was top 10 in FPI. So he has some quality wins to him. And last year's team was fantastic. They return a ton entering 2026. They're top 12 in returning production. And even beyond that, looking beyond 2026, beyond 2025, every year they've had great offenses. They have had improving defenses. And their talent continues to improve. They have signed back-to-back classes, according to 24/7 Sports, that are number one in average rank per recruit. And they're holding on to those players. They're developing them. And in-house guys like Brandon Finney, their entire defensive line, parts of their offensive line, their tight ends, Kenyon Sadiq or Jamari Johnson, some of their receivers, their running backs. They've come out and they have performed at a high level. It's impressive watching what Oregon has done from a roster angle, from a developmental angle, from a coaching angle. So if they don't get it done this year, it's not going to be a, will they ever get it done? No, it won't. Their talent is still improving. Just from a standpoint that second-year players, in terms of a recruiting class rankings, their second-year players and first-year players, on average, are more talented out of high school. That may not matter if the staff's mediocre at developing, but given that Brandon Finney might be their best defensive player, and he's a sophomore, Decorian Moore could be their best receiver by the end of the year, and he's a sophomore, and they might start some players in the offensive line as freshmen who could be immediate impact guys like Jackson Cantwell, well, Oregon will be a national title contender for years after this season, whether they win it all or whether they do not. They play well on offense. They run the ball well. They do a good job blocking downfield. Dante Moore was a great quarterback for them last year, and with limited reps, Brock Thomas looked good. They have Dylan Raiola in the lineup, so in 2027, he'll probably start for them. Akili Smith is a highly touted quarterback, excellent NFL frame, just has to put all that raw talent together to produce. And defensively, I think that their defensive roster is the top of the sport right now. That is the best roster as a complete team, but if you're looking at the defensive side of the football, it's also the best defensive roster in college football. They were a great passing defense, good rushing defense. They'll improve in those areas, and I expect them to improve in terms of sack percentage as well. And Lupoy, I think, was a bit of a liability at defensive coordinator. So Chris Hampton, we'll have to see if you're a liability too, but I don't think that change at coordinator is the downgrade some people are making it out to be. They have the most talented D-line in the country, and their corner room is competing for being the best cornerback room in the country with how Finney performed, with how they've recruited and developed there too. And quietly, they like what they have at linebacker. So what's not to be excited about Oregon's future? I'm buying every bit of it I can. They returned 2/3 of their production from last year, bring in a minor amount of key transfers. They bring some younger players back who had a lot of impactful reps last year, like Nasir Wyatt, Naeem Offord, for example. Others who had a much bigger impact but have room to grow, Brycen Moore, Brandon Finney, Jamari Johnson. I'm excited to see what Oregon is going to do this season. And as of right now, I have them winning the national championship. Even if they don't, though, they're going to be a Big Ten contender and a college football playoff contender year over year over year. Look at how they're recruiting right now. They have a wonderful recruiting class for 2027. Their 2026 and 2025 classes were first in average rank per recruit, which means they're, from a quality angle, actually out-recruiting everyone, technically. And they could have that again this season. And when I see their schedule this year and their schedules in future seasons, I'm not worried about their travel as much as I am for other teams like USC, Washington, or UCLA. Why? Well, they had some rough moments at Iowa or at Penn State, but they won those games. They found ways to beat those teams. Penn State played Indiana close. Iowa played Indiana close. Iowa played USC competitively, even though it was on the road. They fought and battled good teams away from home. Even Texas Tech, several thousands of miles away from home, won those games. So when I see at Oklahoma State in the schedule, or at USC, or at Ohio State, I don't care. What I care about is who's the better team on that field. And with Oregon right now, I see that they are the better team in guaranteed 11 of their 12 matchups. Ohio State could be better than them. They could be better than Ohio State. And from a preseason angle right now, I'd have Ohio State rated as the superior football team. And to be in a situation where you're battling Ohio State, you're battling Georgia, you're battling Indiana, Texas, Notre Dame, Miami for being a title contender, and from a preseason angle, you're returning more quality production than them, you're rated higher in a lot of honest models than they are, that's wild. And that puts you in an elite category of teams. Moving forward, Lanning is going to win a title at Oregon. He is going to. I will promise you that. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'll eat my own words. He has an 85.7% winning percentage. He is 48-8. He won the Big Ten in his first year there. The only reason they beat Ohio State that year was due to him outcoaching, not by this insane margin, but outcoaching in little things Ryan Day. And it's not easy to outcoach Ryan Day. That is a very, very tough task. Very tough task to do. What he did in that game with the onside kick, that reminded me so much, with hindsight, what Kirby Smart did this past season against Texas. You sense that Ohio State's able to move the football, that they're comfortable in this style of game. So what do you do to try to maximize your chances of winning? Well, if they're going to score anyway, an onside kick isn't going to hurt my chances of really stopping them if they can move my defense. Let me take away a possession. Let's get the crowd excited. If we get the football back, we can build on our lead or take the lead, and we can make Ohio State a little bit uncomfortable by showing that we're willing to do whatever it takes to win. They did, and they won. Then Ohio State plastered them in the Rose Bowl, and then they lost to Indiana twice last season. I get that. But they have shown moments of being a title contender, of being one of the best programs. And that's because of Dan Lanning. Dan Lanning has changed out coordinators, changed out position coaches. He's changed out recruits and starting quarterbacks. It doesn't matter. They're still, they overachieved relative to their power rating big time in 2024. That was elite coaching. They had, respectfully, they had no business beating Ohio State, and they had little business beating Penn State that year. And they beat both of them. I understand it was a disappointing finish, but that team to get the number one seed was not quite a miracle, but a step below a miracle in terms of coaching. Last season, the fact that they reloaded and actually improved compared to the prior year, was almost as impressive. Now you have the veterans, you have the high upside talent, you have what it takes to win it all. And whether that's this year or in the future, I think Oregon will do it eventually, and I have them as a top 2 program moving forward, certainly a top 5 one. So that's why I'm buying as much Oregon stock as I can, and I would advise you do the same thing. The public is very low on them. They are viewed as a less acceptable pick to win it all this year than Indiana, Ohio State, Texas, Notre Dame, Miami. And they are better than, I would say, at least 3 of those teams, if not 4. I have them from my research right now, which had Miami as a top 10 team last year. It had Indiana as a top 10 team last season, had them at times going to the playoffs, had them well over their preseason win total of, I believe it was 8.5, had them winning 10 or 11 games depending on the month. And it had, I know, Penn State and Clemson doing great things. They did not. Had Texas doing great things, unfortunately did not. We were on Indiana. We were on Miami. We were also on a team like Georgia Tech to do well. We were on Utah and Texas Tech to bounce back and win 9 or 10 games last year and do well. All I'm saying is, look, we know our stuff here on college football with Sam. We don't get it perfect, but we hit the nail on the head with the hammer more than we slip and end up crushing our thumb with the hammer. And in college football, that's all you can ask for because the sport's so unpredictable. So buy as much Oregon stock as you can. You won't regret it. You will not regret it. Here's why I'm buying as much Indiana stock as I can for the future. I've already bought as much Indiana stock as possible. This is advice to jump on the train if you haven't already. And if you haven't bought as much as you can already, please buy as much as you can. I look at what Indiana's doing in the recruiting world right now, where they're leveling up from being a top 50 recruiting program to a top 25 program there, and they could even be flirting with a top 15 recruiting program this season. I am observing that they were able to not let a single starter from last year enter the portal. They all came back to Indiana or went off to the NFL, and they were able to retain all their coaches except for their strength and conditioning coach. And I see a program that is trending up and is not a 1-year wonder or a 2-year wonder. I am looking at a team and a program that knows how to develop. They know how to scout. They know how to recruit. And they know how to coach and win in big games. And that's all you can ask for in college football. You can't expect to go 16-0 every year. You can't expect to have Nick Saban. I remember when people said Smart would be Nick Saban. Nope. I remember when people said Ryan Day was Nick Saban. Nope. People are in some circles saying it about Curt Cignetti this season. And, well, he probably, if this continues, would have a better argument than the other two due to him doing this at Indiana. I would even put caution there. We need to see a bit more of a sample. We need to see how they do for the next few seasons. But even if he is not, Saban was the GOAT. Saban is the number 1 coach in college football history. If you're not the number 1 coach in college football history, but you're top 5 or you're number 2 or number 3, who the hell cares? You're still winning multiple titles. You're still dominating the league you're in or competing for dominance in that league. And that's where I see Cignetti right now. You go 11-2 at Indiana and then 16-0. I don't care if you did it with certain recruiting or if you had Mendoza or you had certain players. I don't care. Sure, he's losing a lot of his JMU players. However, those JMU players were recruited out of high school and developed by him. Some of them he got in the portal from other schools, such as St. Francis, a D2 school that Elijah Surratt was a part of, to then transfer to JMU where they did really well. He can evaluate in the portal. He can recruit out of high school, even if it's not in the traditional way that others do. And they're leveling up by recruiting bigger, better, faster, stronger players. The process is proven. The staff is proven. This idea that because they're Indiana or because BCR, that they're going to all of a sudden return to being mediocre again, you're not coming on this show and presenting that argument. Will they regress? Will they have years where they regress from the prior year? Will they have cycles? Yes, because that's the nature of every program. Even Saban's Alabama. Even Ohio State. But I can't get over what they did in the past 2 years. It is so insane what that staff did that there's no way that it's a complete fluke. There's no way it's a fluke, period. Maybe going 16-0 and winning it all, you could say is, but I could make a case that it's the same team with national champions every year post 2021 Georgia, and even then they got blessed with an easier schedule. Ohio State was lucky that they got the 12-team playoff the year they lost both of those games. They didn't have to expand to 12 at the same time they expanded conferences. They just happened to do so. Michigan the year before, they did not play a single team with a top 5 offense until Washington, and they coincidentally did not have a very good defense. They had a good schedule that aligned with them. The Georgia teams the year before, similar story. They didn't really play a good team until very later in the season, and that team had flaws. Alabama was just not as deep as Georgia and not as talented. And Ohio State the following year had a year 1 Jim Knowles defense, not a year 2 or 3 Jim Knowles defense. Point being, the people who say, well, if you simulate the season over again, does IU win it all the majority of the time? I don't care about that. In fact, my answer would be yes, given their coaching. So much of their wins and what they did, the Illinois game, the 2 Oregon games, what they're able to do when like punching with Ohio State or punching with Miami, destroying Alabama. Against Penn State and against Iowa, they maintained a lead for much of that game and at times gave up the lead, but then zipped right back, bounced right back. They had the championship DNA. They have the championship coaching. Right now, I think they have the number 1 staff in college football. And if you disagree with that, I would ask, well, does Georgia or Ohio State's current staff go into the portal, hit on all those portal players, and do it with Indiana's BCR? And I think you'd be hard-pressed to say yes to that question. Once can be chalked up as a fluke or just luck. Twice, you can't quite do that. And 3 times in particular, you can't do that at all. They're 27-2 over the past 2 seasons, and last year they were so efficient that they were number 1 in game control, efficiency, PFF grade, FEI rating, S&P plus, FPI, yards per point margin, points per drive margin. I think they were number 1. And in terms of points per play, the only reason they weren't number 1 is because Notre Dame gets big plays against bad teams, and their schedule was not that good. Like, if Notre Dame played the same schedule as Indiana last year, I would promise you IU would be ahead of them in points per play margin. Promise you. And they did that with their talent limitations. And you saw the talent limitations in the Ohio State and Miami games, where Ohio State's players in that game, they were just, on an average basis, better, I would say. Ohio State's defense had a level of hitting to them that Indiana's just didn't have because Sonny Styles, Arvell Reese, and Downs and McDonald were just freaks of nature. Indiana didn't have a Jeremiah Smith in their receiving core. Didn't even have a Carnell Tate in their receiving core. And yet, Indiana won. They had the better QB play. They were more fundamentally sound. Despite not being as talented on the lines of scrimmage, they had the better lines of scrimmage. And they won in a close game. Special teams also helps and better decision making. You look at what they were able to do against Miami. Indiana last year did not have a player that was Ruben Bain Jr. or Akeem Mesidor level good, or Amai Noah good. Probably Mendoza, maybe Pons. Outside of that, no. And yet, Indiana was able to hold on and beat them due to blocking better up front in terms of the run blocking and wide receiver blocking and winning special teams and getting that turnover at the end of the day to seal the deal. As my friend Ohio State DG says on Twitter, these past two teams will be Cignetti's least talented teams at Indiana. Least talented. Their BCR, their size, their measurables will only go up. And those things are not the end-all be-all. Pons didn't fit measurables appropriately as a 5'9 corner, and he was elite. They'll still have some of those players because they care about development and scouting too, and they're elite at those. But there are also players that are elite that also have good measurables, and now they're going to get those players' attention due to how they've been able to develop and game prep and win. Being top three and top three or top two unanimously for offense and defense across power ratings at Indiana is absurd. It doesn't get talked about enough how impressive this coaching performance was. And it never will be talked about enough because people will chalk it up to Mendoza. They'll chalk it up to Indiana's players being 25 years old, which isn't true. Miami actually had an older starting roster than Indiana did, an older roster. And that makes sense when you look at returning production. The fact Miami did get a lot of production in the portal, and yet IU, I think, returns 12 percentage points more production than Miami does. Miami lost more because their roster was older. Straight up. That's what happened there. They'll chalk it up to those things instead of chalking it up to, hey, this was a generational coaching performance, and without this staff, IU has no business winning it all. But with this staff and their process and development and the players buying into it, those things combined put Indiana into business of winning it all and going 16-0, despite lacking something very important for winning it all, having appropriate 4- and 5-star talent. The offense had things to improve on. This is the thing that I'll keep telling people and why I'm buying as much Indiana stock as I can, why I bought as much as I could last year. Their pass blocking was mediocre at best, bad at worst. It was not very good. As I rewatched some Indiana games, it became very evident to me that they were helping out the O-line in pass blocking, in addition to the RPO system that already helps them out there. And yet they had the number one offense and went 16-0. Isn't that absurd? You have a level of pass blocking for a national champion that is probably the worst of the playoff era, possibly worst of the 21st century. And the Miami game exposed that. The Ohio State game exposed it a little bit. The Penn State game is what really sealed the deal because Penn State couldn't get sacks all season long, and they struggled getting pressure, and yet they were able to get a ton of it against Indiana. Part of that had to do with injuries, but depth also matters here. Indiana didn't have a ton of depth. They also didn't have a lot of high-level pass blocking play. And yet, they won it all. Isn't that amazing? And that O-line returns and gets more talented this year. Wide receiver has possibly 2 projected first-round receivers on it this year. They have great running backs, and Hoover's a veteran QB, and I imagine they'll start recruiting at a high level at quarterback as well, and they retain their offensive staff. You look on defense, you lose Pons, you lose Fisher, that stinks, you lose the DNs they do. All their DNs, respectfully, went undrafted. Why can't they get better there with Burnham or Obi Izor or Onsun Sanme or Ndukwe coming back? Why can't they? There's an argument that they'll get worse. There's also an argument they'll get better. And they're pretty much a lock to get better at D tackle with what they return there as well in Mario Landino and Tyreek Tucker. They could improve at linebacker. They returned 4 out of their top 5 linebackers in terms of depth and tackles last season. I imagine safety will probably take a step back, but they return Amari Farrell, and they return Jamari Sharp at corner. A.J. Harris played well in 2024 at Penn State. He could play at an All-American caliber level this year. He could also not play at that type of high level. Their development, their nurturing of talent, the scouting of talent, these are all things that are as important as ever in this era of college football to win it all. And those things aren't going away because the staff is intact. When you look at On3's transfer portal ratings, guess who won the transfer portal? It was Indiana. And that is because On3, as much as I don't like the company, but they do a good job with their portal because they factor in who's leaving and who's coming in. So Texas, for example, or LSU, in 24/7 Sports, they're the number 1 and number 2 transfer portal classes, I believe, because they bring in a lot of players and a lot of them are very good. Ohio State's the same way. Penn State is the same way, although they're not as quality. They don't have as good of quality as those other 3 do. But they also lose quite a bit. Texas lost some starters to different schools due to them wanting higher caliber players or players that fit the scheme better. Ohio State lost some depth pieces because it doesn't sound like they were willing to pay for guys to develop. And LSU was the same thing. Probably a middle ground between Texas and Ohio State, actually. Indiana only lost 10 players, backups, and they brought in a plethora of starters. I think them or Texas Tech, objectively won the transfer portal. And then I would probably put Texas and LSU as your honorable mentions there. I can't stress enough how good Indiana is, how good they're going to be, and what their future is. I don't even have them winning it all this year, but I think they can, and I'm already seeing people say, no, I don't think they can win it all. They lost too much, they're not talented enough, and they're falling back on the same things that bit them in the rear last season with this team, and that bit them in the rear in 2024. There's a trend of this team defying history, and they're doing it with a large enough sample size. 2 years isn't the largest, but it's not one season, and they're defying history not with close wins like TCU or Michigan State did. They're defying history with blowout wins. Wins where if you replay those history-defying wins over and over and over again, IU pretty much wins all of them. The way they beat Alabama wins once out of every 100 times, and that's a history-defying loss that's perfectly sustainable for Indiana. The way Oregon played them in the rematch, Oregon wins more than one time of 100, but Indiana was the better team in a sustainable, replicable way. They won the turnover battle in both games. They outscored Oregon in both games by a lot, and even when you take out the turnovers, they would have won in both of those games just by how both teams played, and they outcoached them. Those are sustainable things. The win total's at 10.5. It's juiced to the over, so Vegas is telling you 11-1's the expectation here. The games I'm circling are Ohio State at home, Michigan on the road, USC at home, and Washington on the road. Those are the 4 losable games. I don't think Indiana is going to lose all 4 of them. I think 9-3 is the absolute worst this team will go. The absolute best is going to be a repeat of 12-0, and I think that with the schedule and how things align and the staff and roster they have, 12-0 is more likely than 9-3. And in fact, I would say much more likely here. I think Indiana's more realistic floor is probably 10-2. I added 9-3 in there, though, because they're still building depth, and they're still building their team talent roster, and the portal has some volatility. So those are things to keep in mind, for sure. Indiana, it's hard to improve off 16-0. So I would say the team, at least from a record standpoint, a win-loss standpoint, is going to regress. But these past 2 teams were Cignetti's least talented teams. They're only going to recruit better from here on out. They're only going to get more talented. Their donor class is being activated. The team is accepted an identity as a football school. And if there is one guy who can defy history, it's Curt Cignetti right now. He's won 93% of his games in a 29-game sample size. It is a smaller sample size than I would like to be even more confident in what he will do, and I'm already as confident as anyone is in what he'll do. But there's enough games against the top 10 there where you're looking, and you think, Ohio State did handle them in 2024, but they kept it close for like a quarter and a half, and if not for the two disastrous special teams mistakes, they could have made it a game into the third quarter. Still think Ohio State would have won, still thought Ohio State was the much better team, but with any other coach with that roster, they probably lose to Ohio State by like 50 that day, and they don't hold them to their second lowest yardage output on the season. It's the same thing with what they did last year to like Oregon. In what world does that roster with any other staff beat Oregon by 34 points? So when the players leave and they come and go and they come and go and they come and go, and not all of them are coming and going, a lot of them are returning and they bring in some talented pieces, that can be cause for concern. But this staff has showed us that, much like other great staffs, Ohio State, Georgia, the players can come and go, the coach and the program remain. And that's what's going to make Oregon great in the future. That's what's going to keep Ohio State and Georgia great. That's why Indiana will continue to be great, and I believe Cignetti will win another national title with the Hoosiers, is because of that reason. Things can come and go, but the leadership, the infrastructure, the staff, if that remains, and it looks to be the case that it will, they're just going to have more success and keep replicating success at a high level. All right. Time to get to some bold predictions, then we'll get on out of here. Curious to see what the chat thinks of what I'm saying. Geez, I am starving. I am starving it. I'm just starving in general. I'm gonna have to cook after this. Okay, let's quickly review some bold predictions for 2026. Hero, or maybe it's H3RO, user from my Discord server. Join the Discord server via the link in the pinned comment so that you can talk to me and talk with College Football with Sam and friends in the Discord server. Hero, maybe H3RO from my Discord server, asks whether or not Ohio State will have two 1,000-yard receivers and how bold that is. If you want to ask a bold prediction, go to my Discord server. The link is in the description, in the pinned comment, and type in my YouTube mailbox channel a bold prediction you have, and if I find it interesting, I might feature it on this channel. You also get to talk to me occasionally and other College Football with Sam, well, subscribers, watchers in my Discord server. But to get to the prediction, I'm going to rate it, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being it's a cold take, it might even be likely to happen, and 10 being it's impossible. Ohio State having two 1,000-yard receivers. Many probably think they did last year. They did not. Jeremiah Smith had 1,000 receiving yards, 1,243 to be specific, and 12 touchdowns. Carnell Tate came very close, but with 14 games, he only had, I believe it was 941. No, it was 875. I don't know where the 941 came from, but 875 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns. And he was a top 5 pick. Ohio State's coaching staff has discussed the depth of the receiver room this year. And that likely translates to experience. It likely translates to they feel comfortable not that it's the best receiver room, but that they have 4 or 5 guys that can play at a comparable level or within margin of error of each other, factoring in experience, talent, explosiveness. Jeremiah Smith is a lock to hit 1,000 receiving yards again, even with the tough schedule. If anything, because of the tough schedule, Ohio State might be forced to throw it more and throw it to him more. And they probably won't be able to rest him in the final 2 games either, because they won't be favored by double digits every week outside of the Texas game. There will be closer games, more competitive games, games against much tougher lines of scrimmage and defenses. So I imagine the staff will go to their X factor in Jeremiah Smith more to win those games. I think that it would be a 0 on the 1 to 10 scale for Jeremiah Smith to have a 1,000-yard season. He's the best player in college football, the best receiver. If positional value wasn't a thing, he'd be round 1, pick 1 in the 2027 NFL draft. So already, this prediction can't be a 9 or a 10 because half of the equation is a lock to be completed. So it's not going to be impossible. It's not going to be nigh or near impossible. It could still be a challenge, though. And I think the history and the style of Arthur Smith could have something to do with that. So Arthur Smith was the offensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans in 2019 and in 2020. In the regular season, the Tennessee Titans had a 1,000-yard receiver in A.J. Brown. Their next highest receiver was Corey Davis at about 600 yards. Now, I know Ohio State will have a larger talent edge over most of its schedule than the Titans did. In the NFL, talent is between the margins. Ohio State will have a definitive talent edge in recruiting. It will be all but one of their games against Oregon, or all but two. Texas could also have a recruiting edge in theory, within margin of error. In terms of development and team performance, they're going to have a definitive talent edge in at least 8 of their games, if not 9. Factoring in IU's development, factoring in maybe Michigan's or USC's, there's a chance one of those schools just pops off and has a fantastic roster. I would bet my money on that being Indiana. I think it will be Indiana. But still, the talent edge for Ohio State is way more in favor of them against their number 1 schedule in college football than the Titans or any NFL team, because the NFL does scheduling at a much higher level and is a much more communistic league in terms of revenue and talent distribution. In 2020, the COVID season, but the NFL managed it pretty well, they had A.J. Brown as a 1,000-yard receiver again, and Corey Davis nearly had 1,000 yards himself, 984. Barely missed off on having 1,000. Arthur Smith was then hired to be the coach of the Atlanta Falcons in 2021, and he was there for 3 seasons. In 2021, the Falcons statistically had a 1,000-yard receiver, a tight end, Kyle Pitts Sr., Russell Gage Jr. had 770 receiving yards. Pitts has had success in the NFL. At 6'6", 250, he, in a lot of ways, is kind of like a receiver playing tight end, but just an absurd freak of nature. In 2022, they did not have a 1,000-yard receiver. Drake London just had 866 receiving yards. And in 2023, they had 950 receiving yards with Drake London. Now, to be fair, they were pretty much playing Desmond Ridder or Marcus Mariota at quarterback in those seasons, who was a below-average NFL QB, and Ohio State will have one of the best in Julian Sayin playing the quarterback position. Arthur Smith is very much about hyper-focusing, from what I can tell statistically, and from what I've heard from people I trust who followed him and who followed the NFL, it is all about trying to hyper-fixate on a handful of players and then building the offense around them. So, for example, A.J. Brown with the Titans. That's their number 1. It's obvious he's their number 1. Derrick Henry at running back 1, it's the same thing. Now, I think Derrick Henry is closer to the top of the NFL food chain at running back than, say, Bo Jackson is in college, because Derrick Henry's just in a league of his own. But Bo Jackson is still one of the top running backs in the sport. Same with Jeremiah Smith at receiver, and really just Ohio State's offensive talent in general. Loves using max protect, typically has good rushing attacks at the NFL level. A lot of these things should translate to what he does at Ohio State. Ohio State's offense last season would have had 2 1,000-yard receivers if they weren't so needy at trying to figure out the rushing offense all season long. They were running the ball a lot. They weren't particularly good at it. At the end of the day, if they passed the football more, they would have effortlessly had 2 1,000-yard receivers. Now, granted, it was with a very easy schedule, a schedule that is a cakewalk compared to this year's schedule. They also did it in 14 games, and there's no guarantee that Ohio State will play 14 games. I'd imagine at the very worst they're going to get 13. I likely think they'll play in 14. I think even playing in 15 games is more likely than 13, because I just have a hard time seeing Ohio State get bounced in the first round of a playoff game, especially if they don't get a bye. However, as we mentioned earlier, they're probably deeper at wide receiver in terms of guys they're comfortable putting out there in the starting role than last year. They also don't have the same upside at receiver or at receiving tight end that they did last year. So you're probably, at least normally, you would expect them to spread the wealth a little bit more. That's not exactly Arthur Smith's style, per se. Again, whether it's Drake London or A.J. Brown or Kyle Pitts, Tyler Algier, Bijan Robinson, Derrick Henry, it's usually a one running back, one receiver focus, and then everything else is built around that. So it's bold. I think we've established that it's certainly not going to be below a 5 on the boldness scale, but I also think we've established it won't be a 9 or 10. We have to get the answer, factor in Ohio State's schedule and opponents. All of these opponents, with the exception of USC, in my opinion, will have a top 15 defense at worst. Indiana and Oregon are my preseason top 2 defenses, and Michigan, Iowa, and Texas will be battling for top 10 defenses. USC will be battling for a top 25 defense with room for higher upside. I've just gotten burned by Riley and defensive improvements too much, so I'm being a bit cautious there. In these games, Ohio State should score points against USC. They should score points against Michigan. I think with Muschamp's man coverage scheme, they should at least score some points against Texas. Probably more than the 14 they did last year, but that's not a guarantee. Iowa, just due to talent, they'll at least score into the 20s, and Iowa's offense being limited. Oregon and Indiana are a little bit of a different beast, I would say. But when you have Jeremiah Smith, Bo Jackson, the defense that Patricia will be running, they'll be competitive in those games, whether a win or whether a loss. What we're really looking at here is, does the offensive line protect Sayin at a high level? Does Sayin have the accuracy combined with the arm strength to get the ball to his receivers time and time again? And can he do that if he's asked to have a high volume of throws every game? Which there's a chance that's how this is for Ohio State. If the rushing attack only improves minimally with this schedule, the rushing offense statistically will be the same, if not even worse, though it'll in reality be better. We're just talking numbers here. And then they'll have to throw more to win games and make sure they don't lose any game on the schedule, or do their best not to. I have Ohio State at 10-2 right now, and I think their rushing offense will improve. I don't think it will improve by the leaps and bounds to immediately be one of the best in college football, giving the running back injuries, the running back depth, and we've seen these offensive line players year over year over year. Montgomery is high upside, but is he a first-round guard? I don't quite know, and I don't like the upside of the tackles, or even the center spot. It's an O-line that is good, great, could be masked by Smith's scheme to be elite. It's much closer to Indiana's O-line last year than, say, Ohio State's O-line when healthy in 2024, or Ohio State's offensive lines under some of those Meyer teams where they were stacked with first-rounders and could just dominate in run blocking. This O-line's built a little bit differently for different purposes, and that's, I think, part of the reason why they brought in Arthur Smith, why they made the Bowen hire after Justin Fry, because they needed to rebuild the unit. It wasn't just a reload thing on the O-line. With how they recruited it, it's a rebuilding thing. They'll be better this year. In fact, right now, I'd have them as a top 15 or top 10 offensive line, which is way higher than I was in them last year. But they'll also be facing a D-line in Texas, Indiana, and Oregon, and maybe even USC and Michigan that could go pound for pound with that O-line. And in the case of Oregon, Indiana, and Texas, those teams will have an edge on the lines of scrimmage with their D-line against Ohio State's O-line. So I do think Ohio State will have to throw more. And with Sayin's accuracy and with those receivers, I do think that means you are going to get more passing yards this year than you did last year, at least in terms of passing yards per game. And as I said, I think Ohio State's going to play in 14 or 15 games because I believe they'll win at least a playoff game when they get in. Yeah, they're going to have more passing yards in totality. So at the end of the day, Ohio State having two 1,000-yard receivers, since Smith, the offensive coordinator, has a larger talent edge than he's ever worked with, since I believe Ohio State will have to throw it more than they did last season, because I do not believe the rushing offense will all of a sudden become 2019 levels and they'll be able to game control everyone, because they'll get enough stops on defense to where their offense won't be at a TOP disadvantage, and because they have talent at receiver. They already have a lock for a 1,000-yard receiver in Jeremiah Smith, Chris Henry, Brock Boyd, Kyle Parker. They have enough talent there where at the end of the day, I don't think that this is a super bold prediction. I mean, Chris Henry, I kind of would be shocked if he's a 1,000-yard receiver this year. Same with any of the receivers outside of Smith. But it's enough of a possibility where, say, so Jeremiah Smith is a lock to be a 1,000-yard receiver. So that's a 10 out of 10 probability. What if Chris Henry is what if his odds of being a 1,000-yard receiver are 1 out of 10? So you look at that, and at the end of the day, their odds when you combine probabilities are much higher for both of them to be 1,000-yard receivers than for possibly any other receiver group in America, because no one else has Jeremiah Smith. No receiver in college football has a lock probability to be a 1,000-yard receiver like Jeremiah Smith does. So then he raises the probability of the entire room by a good degree. It's not likely that they'll have two 1,000-yard receivers, but between Chris Henry, between Brock Boyd, who was one of the first players to lose their black stripe in Ohio State spring practice, and also, don't forget about Guilford, who was a top 50 recruit in last year's cycle, I would put this at a 6 or 7. So we'll go with a 6.5 on the boldness scale. It's a bold prediction that Ohio State will have two 1,000-yard receivers, but because I think they'll have to throw the football more, they have Jeremiah Smith, they have the potential for a second elite receiver to pop off, and they'll play in 14 games, and I think they'll throw the football at a higher volume in terms of play calls. It's not the boldest prediction in the world. It hasn't happened for Ohio State since 2024, and they needed 16 games to get there. But I think with this schedule and with how I look at this team being built and the fact that they're going to want to use Jeremiah Smith as he's by far the best player on offense, I wouldn't be shocked if maybe you see Ohio State, as the season goes on, have one of their more pass-friendly offenses in terms of play calls and in terms of utilizing the talent they have since Day's 2021 and 2022 teams. Maybe not as talented at quarterback or as talented in terms of depth at receiver as those insane receiver and QB rooms were, but in terms of the fit, in terms of the pass protection, in terms of finally having a veteran quarterback, where Sayin is the first Ohio State QB to now have started 2 seasons in a row since CJ Stroud, as Kyle McCord and Will Howard didn't get the chance to do that. I think it's a bold prediction, but only a 6.5. I would not be surprised if this happens, but there is some boldness to it. I'm going to save the UCLA one for tomorrow. I already did my bold prediction for Ohio State. The UCLA one can wait. I'm hungry. I've already been live for almost 3 hours. I just want to tell you all that I appreciate you guys coming on. I appreciate you listening to my stuff. One day, we will have 100 concurrent viewers on a live stream. And we're making progress. And it's my goal to be the best college football channel on YouTube. And we'll see you guys tomorrow for a live show. And hopefully this season we can really break out. Love you guys. Thank you so much for watching. And I will see you all very soon.